So starting last year, I decided to go back and play through all the Spider-Man games that released since the year 2000. Starting with Spider-Man PS1 all the way to last year's Marvel Spider-Man 2, I reviewed every game, except the Amazing Spider-Man 1 since my PS3 wouldn't read the disc. Anyways, I went through all the other console games plus 2 handheld titles. So this video serves as a compilation of every Spider-Man game that I played, with timestamps in the description so you can find the game that you want to see. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for watching.
What a wuss. Hey, wanna race? Parker hates it when I get the drop on him.
I hate it when he gets the drop on me.
Over the course of the past 30 years, we have gotten many Spider-Man games, but I feel like they really didn't start becoming popular until the release of the 3D games. The year is 2000, and coming off a 4-year hiatus with no Spider-Man games, it was time for Spidey to come back and deliver a whole new experience. Spider-Man 1 for the PlayStation 1 was developed by Neversoft and published by Activision. The game was first announced on December 2nd, 1998, and used the same engine as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Both Spider-Man 1 and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater were developed by Neversoft and released only weeks apart from each other, with Spider-Man releasing on September 1st, 2000, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 releasing on September 20th, 2000. As the first Spider-Man game to be created in 3D, this action-adventure game was created to give the players the most authentic Spider-Man experience possible. The devs tried to push the limit of what they could achieve on the PS1 by making the player really feel like they were Spider-Man. This involved creating realistic web swinging and the ability to crawl all over individual rooms.
Well, it was the day we got Spidey. You could jump off a building, hit your swing button, swing to a building, crawl up, go over nice complicated surfaces, pop down, and then start fist fighting with a bad guy that's try to ruin the world. And we just looked at each other, all laughed and smiled and said, we got something that's really fun, even just to move the character around.
It was apparent that Neversoft was committed to making the best Spider-Man game ever up to that point. It was willing to do anything to reach that goal, and I think it's safe to say that they nailed it.
Technology is the light that will cut through the darkness. When humanity conforms to a single truth, a truth based in technological progress and scientific method, we will be unstoppable. I, Dr. Otto Octavius, vow as a scientist and businessman that my duties to humankind will be fulfilled. Thank you. Thank you.
The story for this game starts out with a reformed Dr. Otto Octavius holding a presentation at the Science Expo 2000, but the event ends in chaos as a Spider-Man imposter appears and steals the equipment off the stage. It's made clear that the Spider-Man that stole the equipment is an imposter as we see Peter run into Eddie Brock, who is there taking pictures for the Daily Bugle for J. Jonah Jameson, giving us 100% confirmation that someone is impersonating Spider-Man. Brock then becomes enraged after the fake Spider-Man breaks his camera and gives in to the Venom symbiote, swearing he will get revenge against Spider-Man no matter what.
You won't be able to get a job taking wedding pictures in Siberia!
I tried to fight it. Can't fight him anymore! Again. Innocence falls prey to the evil of Spider-Man. Rest easy, Brock. Venom is here. And if it's the last thing we ever do, Jameson and the insect are gonna pay.
As we continue on, the actual Spider-Man is being hunted by the police, as they think he's responsible for the theft at Octavius' event. We then see 2 figures release fog from a hidden base that covers the city streets. Even though it's just fog, you can't fall into it or else you would die instantly. Maybe it would have been better to call this poison, as it would make more sense if you were to die when you entered it than fog would, but who knows. I played this game as a kid but could not remember how the fog actually got into the streets to begin with, so it was nice to finally see how the fog appeared in the first place. Now we begin the first mission in the game.
Welcome, true believers and newcomers alike. Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee here. Once again, we find our hero Peter Parker, better known around the world as the Amazing Spider-Man, in a heap of trouble. But this is just the beginning, Spidey fans. So get ready for a true superhero action thriller, packed to the brim with thrills and chills, twists and turns, more supervillains than you can shake a web at, and of course, non-stop web-slinging, wall-crawling action.
We then meet with Black Cat, who if you look closely is not wearing her mask. In addition, in this game, Peter is married to MJ, nixing Spider-Man and Black Cat's potential relationship. This mission has you learn the basic mechanics of the game and has you swing over to the bank to stop a robbery by the Jade Syndicate. This mission is my most vivid memory of my time playing this as a kid on the PlayStation 1. To my surprise, the wall crawling was surprisingly fluid, as you crawled all over the ceiling and then would drop down to get the jump on enemies. When you start to get low on health, there are these floating white spiders with a cross that would refill your health. In the top left corner, you can see your player icon health bar and the amount of web fluid you would use along with the amount of canisters you had left. As you use up the web fluid, the number of canisters you had would decrease. You could refill these canisters by finding floating blue spiders scattered across the area, similar to the white health spiders. I'm going to assume that the amount of drops that can be found on each mission depend on the difficulty you're playing on, as I didn't test playing on multiple difficulties, but it would make sense if that was the case. So if you're playing on kid mode, the drops would be everywhere, but if you're on hard, then the drops would be much more scarce. The layout of the bank was done really well, as it wasn't hard to figure out where to go next after clearing out a group of enemies. Over the course of this mission, you save multiple civilians who are being held hostage by the Syndicate, while still learning some moves that you can use during combat. The thugs that you find inside the bank could perform physical attacks, and some of the Jade Syndicate men actually have weapons that they would use against you. Towards the end of the mission, we stop a bomb from exploding by beating up some guards, grabbing and throwing the bomb into a safe. This was a great first mission as it showed you everything you needed to know so you could complete the later missions, because, believe it or not, this game is harder than it looks.
Not this time, guys. Jonah, I have shot to the bank robbery.
Parker, shut up and dial 911. Scorpion's here, and you have to...
Uh-oh, Spidey. Scorpions had it out for old J. Jonah Jameson from day one, blaming Jameson for being stuck in his scorpion suit. Spidey had better get there quickly, or JJJ may end up in the obituaries of his own paper.
After stopping the bank robbery, we discover that Scorpion is trying to kill J. Jonah Jameson, the only person he hates more than Spider-Man, as he provided the funding for the experiment that caused him to turn into the Scorpion in the first place. To start off, this mission has you swinging from building to building to try and reach Jameson before Scorpion kills him. This isn't hard at all, as you don't even have to fight the enemies. You can just run right past them as you traverse each rooftop. Once we arrive at the Daily Bugle, we have our first boss fight, the Scorpion.
Listen, Gargan, it's a new millennium. Lots of high-tech. There may be some way we can get you out of that suit.
You put me in this suit. Now I'm going to make you pay.
Get over it, Gargan.
You ruined my life, so now I'll end yours.
You fight inside a room with Jameson hiding in the corner as you are tasked with defeating Scorpion, but also protecting Jonah from damage, as he has a small health bar that will lower if he takes any hits. This fight isn't hard, as Scorpion mostly just uses a stinger that will punch you if you try and attack from close range. He's vulnerable to Spidey's webbing, so it's easy to wrap him up and just punch away. Even though he's easy, you can't be careless, as he does counterattack often, which can knock you down instantly. If you just be on guard for the counterattacks and keep away from Jameson, this fight should be a breeze. After defeating Scorpion, Jonah, being the ungrateful man he is, calls the police on us and we flee the scene.
I don't know what you're trying to pull by saving my life, but it won't work.
Oh, you're just too clever for me, JJ.
There he is, officers! The man behind the Science Expo heist! Shoot him now! Shoot him!
JJ, you're out of the wheel. I mean it this time.
Then we meet Daredevil, who thinks we could be guilty, but we convince him otherwise, and then he leaves the rooftop. After having fought Scorpion, this game was starting to feel like I was playing the animated Spider-Man cartoon that was popular during the 90s. Even the character designs of all the heroes and villains look similar to the game interpretation of them. For example, let's compare the Daredevil in this game to the Daredevil in the animated show. As you can see, the suit he wears is very similar to the show, almost to the point that it feels like it was just copied straight from it. Having watched the entire series, and then seeing those same characters portrayed in the game, just added to the realness of the game, even though all of these characters are fiction. Immediately after that, we're ambushed by a police helicopter leading to a really long chase sequence. This chase sequence definitely caught me by surprise. It just felt like the cops would never stop chasing me, as every building I swung to, the helicopter was right there. This whole section required you to focus, as there were missiles being shot at you alongside enemies that appeared on every rooftop. Then to make matters worse, you have to climb up this building and follow a certain path to avoid the gunfire and explosions. I died on this section more times than I would like to admit. Although, to think that all of this would be included in a PS1 game was definitely unexpected. But anyways, we finally escaped the police and were reunited with Black Cat and start the third mission.
Pay for that tower? Uh-oh, the spider sense tingling. One more step and it's a load of web fluid sticking you to that wall.
Well, it's not the most romantic proposition I've ever had.
Black Cat? Oh, I'm so glad it's you.
Good to see you too, big boy, but you got a problem.
This mission starts off with Black Cat telling us that Rhino is wreaking havoc at the power plant and Venom has captured Mary Jane in an attempt to lure Spider-Man out to fight. Black Cat tries to convince Peter that she can take Rhino alone, but Peter disagrees. I thought this was a cool little nod to the comics, where there are moments that Peter realizes it would be safer for both him and Black Cat if he would fight the supervillain alone. After some debate, we decide to fight Rhino first at the power plant. Once we arrive, you can see a helicopter flying away with some sort of valuable tech, showing that the time Spider-Man and Black Cat took figuring out who to fight first actually mattered, since it allowed the goods to be stolen. Before we even start the fight, we see Black Cat get absolutely rammed by Rhino, taking her out the fight before it even started. The Rhino boss fight is a little bit harder than the Scorpion fight, but not by much. You fight him in this open area that has these electrical boxes in the middle. If you bait Rhino into charging into these boxes, they electrocute him and cause a lot of damage. Just continuously get Rhino to charge into the boxes and you'll have this boss finished in no time. One funny little detail I noticed is that when Rhino runs into a generator, his character icon changes face to show he is getting shocked. After the fight, an injured Black Cat is taken by the paramedics, but it's shown that the drivers are mysterious figures, who seem to be taking her somewhere else other than the hospital.
Help me. They're not really paramedics.
Perfect. Perfect.
Well, that's my story, Johnny.
Looks like you're in a lot of trouble. You'll find Venom.
But how? Venom is invisible to my spider sense.
Knowing your luck, Venom will find you. Have faith,
After we
Spidey.
leave the scene, we meet Human Torch, who gives us a little pep talk about finding Venom so we can rescue MJ. Moments later, Venom appears and leads us on a chase throughout the city. This chase sequence really just showed how fast Venom was. All this time we were swinging from building to building and it felt like we were going fast, but then Venom just shows up and makes it obvious that we're not that fast. But I digress. We continue chasing Venom and end up fighting him in the back alley right behind the Hellfire Club, a nod to the social club for the wealthy and those with high social status, whose purpose was to gain power through their political and financial influence rather than traditional means of conquest, a subtle yet cool nod to the group that could easily be missed. This fight wasn't difficult, as all Venom does is vanish around the alley, and once you find where he is, you can just start punching away, and after doing enough damage, he flees to the sewers. Once we got to the sewers, I knew instantly what kind of enemies we would encounter. Contrary to the typical thugs we've been fighting so far, littered throughout the sewers are lizards. These lizard men pop up constantly and can perform physical attacks while spitting acid on you from long range. The platforming in the sewers is well done, as you have to use Spider-Man's reticle to aim and swing from pipe to pipe to avoid falling into the water below. As you venture deeper into the sewers, the game included the one thing I was hoping it wouldn't, and that was a maze. Eventually, Venom sends you down this path that has openings on the left and right as you must figure out where to go to find the room that contains MJ. Honestly, I don't know how I figured this out in a decent time, but as I made my way towards the end of the path, I run into Lizard, who is imprisoned in his own lair. Lizard then gives you instructions on where MJ is located. He says them pretty fast, so if you're not paying attention, you will definitely get lost, as there's no way to get him to repeat the dialogue. Maybe if you die and return, but I don't think that would work.
She's in the lair at the end of the maze. There's only one way to get there. Go back along this tunnel and cross over 2 waterways. At the 3rd waterway, go right. Follow it around the corners, past the machinery, skip the first tunnel intersection, then go right at the next one. You will find the woman there.
Help! Is anybody there? Help me!
Mary Jane!
Please!
Hey, you made it!
Venom!
I'd let you see your wifey poo, but she's in the bath right now. So, what do you say, Spunky? Let's finish this.
Anyways, we finally find MJ as she is submerged in a cage underwater. Here's when we fight Venom, and have to keep MJ from drowning in the process. This fight doesn't require much skill, as Venom just teleports back and forth between the switches, and once you know where he's going to teleport to, you can just beat him up quickly. Shooting the switches first, then fighting Venom is the strategy I used in this fight, and I was able to beat him in just minutes. After defeating Venom and rescuing MJ, we convince the symbiote that we've been framed, and are purposely being pitted against each other. After some consideration, Venom decides to join us, and we head back to the Daily Bugle to look for the clues surrounding the imposter's identity.
I need Jameson's help on this. We're going to the Bugle.
Jameson! We hate Jameson.
You bonehead. We're not going to see Jameson. We're going to use his computer database.
Ooh, are we gonna surf the web?
Let's just go, okay?
Moments after arriving at the Daily Bugle, Venom senses Carnage, his symbiote offspring who is known to have been bonded with Cletus Cassidy, the infamous serial killer who escaped Riker's island prison. Having sensed the presence of Carnage, Venom jumps and leaves Spider-Man to go find him.
Stop him.
Now?
Yes, now. We have no choice.
Wait, make more noise. I'm only breaking and entering here. Spider sense tingling. Now what? Spidey, whoever's behind all this, got symbiotes.
Meanwhile, we discover that the building is infested with symbiotes. To deal with these monsters, we have to find and destroy generators that are producing these symbiotes. A cool mechanic that was introduced at this point in the game was the flammable web fluid. Up to this point, we have only had normal webs that we could use to web up the enemies, but if you picked up this red spider, it would make that fluid flammable, making it really easy to kill the symbiotes that were roaming around the building. Normally, the symbiotes would take a handful of hits to go down, but with the flammable web fluid, they would die almost instantly. Once we destroy the symbiotes, we cleanse the building of them and rescue the hostages that were trapped. After destroying the generators, we finally discover the identity of the Spider-Man imposter, Mysterio. This brings us to the Mysterio boss fight.
I've wanted to shut that mouth of yours. Finally, that time is upon me.
At last, I will crush you once and for all! Now, little spider, you will die!
Is it too late for us to be friends?
I thought this fight was the second toughest fight in the game. Mysterio uses his usual tricks to grow super big. To defeat him, you had to use your web shot, or what I like to call web kamehameha, on the power nodes that were all over his body. What made this difficult was that he would change his attacks based on the level of the ground you were standing on. So if you're on the very bottom, he would just constantly stomp you. If you went a floor above, he would then summon objects out of thin air that would materialize and deal damage if you didn't avoid it. The worst attack he performed was this swiping grab that comes from the left side of your screen. It's easy to dodge, but the swipe is surprisingly fast, forcing you to time your jumps correctly. After taking out all the power nodes on his body, the second phase starts. Up to this point, none of the bosses even had a second phase, so you already know I died a couple times. During this second phase, the floor has a blue circle around it that would flash with electricity that would harm you if touched. While trying to avoid the electricity, you had to web shoot his helmet. After you cause enough damage, Mysterio is finally defeated. After his defeat, Mysterio informs us that his bosses plan to infest the whole city with symbiotes, and the fog that covers the city serves as an alert for the symbiotes that would get the citizens ready for symbiosis. After receiving the intel from Mysterio, we start the last mission in the game.
I'm here, Frank. What's up?
Spider-Man's here, Microchip.
What range?
100 yards, maybe. Easy shot.
Very funny, Frank.
Huh? He spotted me, but how could he? I lost him.
What happened?
He took out my scope.
Hey, tough guy. Sorry about that expensive lens, Punisher.
Something tells me we have the same objective here.
The information we received led us to a warehouse which was hiding in an underground base, which was the source of where all the symbiotes were coming from. We run into the Punisher on our way to the actual warehouse called Warehouse 65. With his help, we were able to infiltrate the base. Once we're inside the base, we find that Black Cat has been trapped here after being kidnapped in the ambulance. In order to save her, we have to go to multiple rooms and pull levers that will close off the vents that are releasing the fog into the city. This wasn't hard as you just had to go to each room and press square. It required pretty much no skill at all.
Listen to me, whoever you are. No one can control the symbiotes. No one!
I need not control the symbiote, Spider-Man.
Doc Ock?
Once we rescue Black Cat and destroy some more generators, we discover that the mastermind behind this entire plan is Otto Octavius himself, with the help of Carnage. Doc Ock explains that he tricked everyone into thinking he was reformed so he could rule the world by making everyone bond with the symbiote. Seconds later, Venom appears and fights Carnage, leaving us to fight Doc Ock one-on-one.
Ooh, I smell bad symbiote, and it ain't me!
Bring it on, Grandpa!
Alone at last.
Let us end this, Spider-Man.
I feel like I've been saying this a lot, but this boss fight wasn't too hard either. Dr. Octopus stands inside an electric barrier that can only be taken down by webbing up the generators that were powering it. This fight can be a little tricky, as while you're waiting for the switches to drop down, it will use his tentacles to take swipes and jabs at you. If you don't pay attention, you will get hit by these a lot. Once you remove his barrier, you can just punch and kick away, lowering his health. Rinse and repeat this process of taking down the barrier and then inflicting damage, and Ock goes down pretty quickly. After defeating Doc Ock, we see Venom get KO'd by Carnage, making us fight Carnage by ourselves.
Wake up, Brock.
Look out. Parker, behind you.
You say?
This Carnage boss fight is probably the hardest fight in the game. How to defeat him is not hard, you just need to get him in the area that contains the sonic waves. But actually getting him in there takes a little bit of skill, as he constantly moves around, and then when you close the distance, he will perform some physical attacks. Let's say you land some punches and kicks. Those do cause some damage, but it's minimal. In order to get him trapped in the sonic wave area, you need to punch or kick him into it, which is tough. The camera is focused on you so you can hit Carnage, but as you try to angle it so Carnage's back is to the sonic waves, he will either move or it just won't work. What I ended up doing was just getting him stuck on the wall and then just hitting him until his health slowly went down to zero. It was a cheap way to win the fight, but it worked. But of course, the game isn't over there. The Carnage symbiote then leaves Cletus Cassidy and merges with Dr. Octopus to create Monster Ock.
I've met anyway. Take a breather, Spidey. It's over. Well, just another day in the life. Whoa! What the? Is that Ock?
Now we arrive at this heart-racing chase sequence. In order to escape, we must run away from Monster Ock while ascending each floor of the base. This chase section is hard as the camera is angled so you're running towards it, but the hallways still move in different directions. And to make matters worse, you have to zip up to get to the next floor, and if you're too slow webbing up, Monster Ock catches you and it's game over. This took a couple tries, as trying to figure out the fastest way to maneuver each hallway was definitely a challenge. We finally escaped the base, which is blown up, taking Monster Ock with it in the explosion. To everyone's surprise, the Carnage symbiote saved Ock from dying in the blast, as he is grabbed by Spider-Man, and we are saved by Captain America, who was called by Black Cat and Venom as the Carnage symbiote escapes.
It's a good thing Black Cat gave me a call, son.
Looks like just in time.
Hey, Spidey, can you get us Captain America's autograph?
Oh, brother.
After this, we see Spider-Man playing cards with Daredevil, Punisher, and Captain America, while Black Cat and the Human Torch are seen dancing nearby. A cool detail I noticed is that if you look at the bottle Daredevil is drinking, it's called superhero juice. Meanwhile, in prison, Scorpion makes fun of all the villains we faced as he realizes that they all fought and lost to Spider-Man no matter what they did. The most obvious thing I noticed was the poster on the wall of a woman with a fishbowl on her head instead of a normal woman, and the bandages Mysterio had wrapped around his face. As Doc Ock bangs his head on the jail bars, this story finally reaches its conclusion, setting us up for the next game, Spider-Man 2: Enter Electro. This sequel was made not by Neversoft but by Vicarious Visions and would eventually release in 2001. Overall, this story was fantastic. From the simplicity of the missions to the boss fights, every new mission was intriguing and felt fresh. This game did a great job of creating an exciting yet engaging story that introduced new characters along the way. What I enjoyed the most was that this story never took itself too seriously. Obviously there were important things going on, but at the end of it all, it just felt like your classic animated TV show ending. I wish more games released today that had a simple but fun story like this.
The Venom Marathon continues on the biggest TV in New York. We're shouting out to the whole big rotten apple here, people.
Sad thing is, he'll probably get his own talk show for this.
If there's one thing that stands out to me more than the story, it's the voice acting. Every person who had a voice role in this game just crushed it. It gave this layer of authenticity to the game that made every conversation feel believable, like these are lines that these characters would actually say, if they were real. I thought I would take just a little bit of time to show the faces behind some of the characters we heard throughout the story.
Being Spider-Man has given me a lot and taken a lot away, but one thing never changes. My responsibility to use my powers for others before myself, no matter what the cost.
Rino Romano, who had voiced Spider-Man and Peter Parker, would also be the voice for the same characters in Spider-Man Unlimited, which aired in 1999.
In another context, the idea of a goat man dressed like a doctor might be amusing.
Who dares? Face me, coward! Face a worthy foe. Spider-Man?
Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., who voiced Dr. Octopus, also voiced Alfred in the animated Batman series that aired in the late 90s.
Rough night of crime fighting, sir?
Very.
Well, you'll be happy to know I've drawn you a bath. Whenever you're ready.
What's the deal, Alfred?
I said I drew you a bath, sir.
Your guess is as good as mine. The guys in the ambulance must have drugged me because the next thing I knew I woke up here. You gotta get me out of here.
Jennifer Hale voiced Black Cat not only in the game, but in the Spider-Man animated series that aired in 1995 as well.
I knew you'd come, Spider.
Who are you?
Just a stray black cat. Silly Spider. Cats always land on their feet.
Behind you.
Say?
Dee Bradley Baker voiced a handful of characters including Carnage, Rhino, J. Jonah Jameson, Daredevil, and Lizard, and has had a plethora of roles including voicing Dad in the cartoon Cow and Chicken.
We're all gonna die! Every man for himself!
It's a good thing Black Cat gave me a call, son.
Looks like just in time.
Hey, Spidey, can you get us Captain America's autograph?
Oh, brother.
Darren Norris voiced Venom, Mysterio, Scorpion, Punisher, Human Torch, and Captain America, and would have other voice roles like Jack Smith in American Dad.
not taking Stan on a mission. You're taking him on a jewel heist.
Keep your pretty mouth shut and everything'll be Punky Brewster.
Dad, you're not looking!
Look, either you tell Stan the truth or I will.
All right, Francine. This won't be easy, but I'll tell him. First, I'm gonna need a shot of Dutch courage. Ha! Straight to the brain.
Stan Lee, the co-creator for Spider-Man, was the narrator for the game, as you would hear him during certain missions.
Oh boy, Spidey fans, Black Cat is out. Rhino's looking to take Spidey down as well.
I just wanted to shed some light on this amazing voice cast who really brought these characters to life and gave them the personalities they needed to make this game great. The music in this game was top notch as well. Every time you would fight an enemy, you would hear some sort of fighting music like this. Each time you fought a new opponent or entered a new area, the theme that played fit perfectly and added to the overall atmosphere of the game. Another one of my favorite tracks was during the bank heist. The music in this game, combined with the voice acting, helped create a memorable audio experience that enhanced important story moments and action sequences. This game included a lot of unlockables that could be accessed after completing the story or by completing any of the other game modes. For a PS1 game, this game offered a lot more content than some games do today, which is actually crazy to say. It included a character viewer that had information on every character that was in the game. What's cool is that each one was described briefly by Stan Lee.
Now reformed, Dr. Otto Octavius is using his scientific knowledge for the good of humanity. One of Parker's photojournalistic rivals, Brock blames Parker for his bad reputation as a reporter. Add one alien symbiote, and you've got Venom.
In the training mode, you had 5 different kinds of training to choose from. The first was Time Attack, where you had to eliminate as many people as possible in the selected time. This was fun as you did nothing but beat up enemies as fast as possible. The combat in this game is somewhat addicting, so you can easily spend a lot of time trying to achieve a high score in this mode. The second was Survival Mode, where you had to dodge opponents for as long as possible. I think this is one of the harder modes as the game throws a lot of enemies at you, and many of them have guns, making it tricky to try and dodge everyone. It's a good thing you can jump high, because that definitely came in handy during this challenge. Out of all the challenges, this is the one I wouldn't see myself coming back to very often. The third challenge was called Speed Training, which had you using your webs to swing to the destination as fast as possible. This time challenge was really fun, but had the potential to be even better. If you had the ability to run up walls or just move faster, rather than getting stuck to a wall and having to climb up it in order to go forward, this mode would be so much better. But for its time, it's still enjoyable. The fourth of the training modes was called Target Practice, which gave you good guy and bad guy targets to shoot with your web, with you gaining points for each foe webbed up. This was my favorite of the training modes as it's really fun to try and shoot the targets, but avoid hitting the wrong ones. It reminded me of the gun courses from Jak 2 and 3, where they had a similar system, in which you had to shoot the enemies, but not the civilians. The last of the training modes was called Item Collection, which had you collecting the pickups as quickly as possible. The item collection challenge is easy, but you have to move faster than you realize, as all the pickups aren't just right in front of you. There are some high and down below, and in order to reach those, you have to collect the easy ones first. If you're someone who enjoys getting collectibles during the story, then this challenge is definitely for you. There was a comic collection section that contained all the comic book covers you could find during your playthrough of the game. It was pretty cool to see some of these comic covers as they recognize iconic moments during Peter Parker's journey as Spider-Man. I hope that we get to see even more Spider-Man stories be adapted into some sort of live-action version. Seeing these comic covers reminded me that there's so many stories that haven't been told yet. Then there's villains we haven't even seen, like the Hobgoblin, Chameleon, Hydra Man, and others. The fact this game even referenced the comics and showed the history of Spider-Man over the years is something I really appreciated. But anyways, there was a special section where you could look at the costumes you unlocked, pick certain levels to play, and enter cheats. Some of the costumes that were available included additional abilities that would help you in future playthroughs. Some of the suits that you could wear included the symbiote suit, which would give you unlimited webbing, Spider-Man 2099, which gave you enhanced strength, Captain Universe, which made you invulnerable, gave you enhanced strength and unlimited webbing, and you could also just be Peter Parker as well. If you don't want to unlock everything the normal way, I recommend inputting the cheat codes. There are some pretty neat cheats that you can input to unlock everything in the gallery and all the suits, so it's definitely worth googling these codes and giving them a try. Lastly, the game has a what if mode that keeps the main story but changes some things that happen. Some of these things are character deaths, dialogue, and other things. The amount of extra content this game offers increases its replay value and entices you to try and unlock the costumes and comic book covers if you don't want to use the cheats. Neversoft's Spider-Man is the 3D Spider-Man game that was desperately needed at the time. The combination of story, voice acting, music, and content just makes this game the whole package. The love and attention the devs put in this game is apparent in every mission, and really served as the first step towards making Spider-Man the most popular superhero video game character we have today. This game laid the foundation for the sequels we would receive in the future, and I'm so happy I decided to revisit this game so many years later. Coming off the success of Neversoft's Spider-Man, the hero was in a great position for a sequel game. However, this time around it would be developed by Vicarious Visions and not Neversoft. Would Vicarious Visions be able to replicate the same type of experience from the original game? Would they be able to make the necessary upgrades to make this sequel better than the first? We would soon find out. We pick up shortly after the events of the first Spider-Man, where we defeated Doc Ock and the other villains, saving everyone in the city from being turned into symbiotes. Electro has been orchestrating a series of robberies across New York City, and it's up to us to investigate why. The first thing I noticed regarding the story was how alone Spider-Man was. Even though we encountered different villains during every mission, it just felt like we had no backup or help at any time. In the original game, right from the start, we had Black Cat by our side. And even when we were separated from her, it still felt like we weren't alone, due to the inclusion of other heroes like Daredevil, Captain America, etc. As we got deeper into the plot, I found myself saying, where is my help? Where are the other heroes? I understand that the game needed to show off other characters that weren't in the first, but it just felt like there were a lot of villains and not enough heroes. Now I know that the heroes wouldn't have helped us much in a fight, but it's still nice to see Spider-Man interact with others that weren't just villains. The banter between the heroes helped ease the tension and not make every single scene so serious, so the lack of other heroes was definitely missed. The plot for this game was original, but not too boring that it would struggle to keep your attention. Pretty much Electro's main plan is to acquire the BioNexus device, the device that would enhance his powers and make him almost unstoppable. He pretty much wanted the device that Electro had in Spider-Man No Way Home. If you know, you know. Over the course of the story, we fight different villains than the first game, which included Shocker, Hammerhead, Sandman, and the Lizard, with all but the Lizard working with Electro against Spider-Man. What I will give this game credit for is how they introduced the villains from mission to mission. For example, after defeating Sandman for the first time, we hop on a train only to run into the Beetle, who escapes with a briefcase. To just come off a boss fight and then be introduced to another villain immediately was really well done. It wasn't in your face, but just having him appear on the train was just subtle enough to surprise me a bit. Each mission you go through felt like a small piece of the puzzle, as after completing the objective, another small layer of the story was peeled back, and we learned a little bit more about what was going on. Even still, the story was missing some actual emotion. It wasn't until the end fight with Electro that I actually felt something. Now don't get me wrong, I wasn't expecting a whole lot since this game is 22 years old, but it just lacked some sort of emotion. The first game had a serious yet comedic tone that was made apparent from the very beginning. However, in this game, it was just all seriousness right from the start. The devs tried to add some comedic elements with the Daily Bugle newspapers that would appear at the start of every mission, but it didn't hit the same. Spider-Man always has his punchlines and quirky jokes, but those only go so far when he's not surrounded by other heroes to bounce those off of. The villains aren't the brightest, so they just accept whatever insults he throws at them like it was no big deal. The lack of emotion doesn't hinder the game dramatically, it's just something I noticed by the end of my playthrough. I don't think the story for this game is bad, as Electro's motivations were clear and it makes sense why he would want the device, but it just didn't hit the same as the first game. The villains in this game were all pawns used by Electro to further his own goal, but they didn't really have any reason of their own to try and kill Spider-Man. Like in the first game, we fight Scorpion, who is trying to kill Jameson but is also working for Doc Ock. We know Scorpion hates Spider-Man, but what other reason do we have to fight him? His hatred for Jameson justifies that reason. Overall, I thought this story was decent but not better than the first. It just felt like the devs wanted to use a group of different villains in this game but couldn't decide a good reason for all of them to work together in the first place. In addition, having Electro be the leader of this group just felt a little off. In my opinion, Electro always felt like a top henchman type villain, never the leader of an actual group. I didn't think Electro was portrayed badly, but I wasn't a fan of his role in this particular scenario. Nonetheless, this story is worth going through once, especially if you were a fan of the first game. The gameplay is the aspect of this game that changed the most from its predecessor. To start off with, you can finally play on the ground. No longer we have fog covering the streets of New York City as we traverse various locations with the ability to fight in the city streets. Now, even though the streets are open, the streets are only long hallways that eventually have invisible barriers that prevent you from going forward. I wasn't expecting any more than this considering this was a PlayStation 1 game, but just being able to be on the streets felt great. Who knew that something so simple could make this much of a difference? A big difference from the first game is that Beast from X-Men guides you through the tutorial versus Black Cat. In addition, the tutorial for this game isn't as in-depth as before. It's like the devs assume that if you're playing this game, then you played the original and didn't need as much of a tutorial. I would say that if you're going to play this game for the first time, then I would go straight to the training mode first and learn all the mechanics of the game, because there are missions where you need to perform certain movements that you aren't shown during the initial tutorial. Once you complete the training, then start up the story. Some new additions to the game were the different enemy types. The original had a couple enemy variations, but this game really took it to another level. Depending on the level, we had to fight gangsters, robots, drones, mercenaries, and of course, the main villains. This added more variety to each level, helping them feel unique instead of just fighting the same enemy no matter the location. Some of these enemies are really annoying, but not because they were difficult to kill, but because of the game itself. Let me explain. There is a mission where you have to infiltrate this highly guarded base where there are tons of traps and drones. The drones are easy to kill but are small and fly around constantly. This wouldn't be a big deal if the camera wasn't absolutely terrible. If you weren't aware, the camera turns based on which way Spider-Man is facing. So if your enemy comes from the north but you're facing the south, you can't just adjust the camera to destroy the enemy unless you quickly turn Spider-Man in that specific direction. When you have multiple drones you need to kill, and if you don't kill them they destroy generators, ending the mission, it gets really frustrating. The camera in both games is so bad, but the level design of this game really brings this issue up front and center. There are many times where you need to go up somewhere or find something and the camera makes all of that difficult to do. On top of that, having multiple enemies attacking you proves to be a real challenge, as you have to constantly turn the camera in each direction to face the enemy so you can attack it. It's no problem when you have enemies that are more stationary, but for those enemies that move constantly like the drones, it's infuriating. If there was one thing that needed to be overhauled and wasn't, it was the camera. The level design for this game is so much worse than before. I see the vision the devs were going for, as the levels themselves are larger in scale and incorporate more into each mission, making them longer in length. But too many times I found myself unsure of what to do next. I understand that games years ago didn't hold your hand and tell you what to do or where to go, but sometimes Peter would just make a statement and that was it. After he said that sentence, you just gotta figure it out. Like this, for example.
This place is gigantic. From the looks of all this electricity around me, this must be the main power conduit for all of biotech.
Now, after crawling all over the walls and jumping from platform to platform, I just happened to look up and find a small crevice where the first switch was. If a switch was going to be hidden way up there, then why didn't we have the spider compass to help point us in the right direction? This is just one of many examples where it's kinda ambiguous and left open pertaining to what exactly you needed to do to complete the mission. It's clear that the devs wanted to make each level more expansive, and I think they achieved this, as there are more puzzles, enemies, and platforming in this game than the first, but it's how they're implemented that's the problem. To put it simply, I think that what the devs were trying to achieve was too ambitious for the PS1. I could see what they were trying to do in each mission, but I don't think it was fleshed out enough to make it flow well on the current gen systems. The idea for these missions were great, but the execution was flawed. The boss fights required more thinking and skill than before, as in order to defeat each boss, you had to perform certain actions that would make each fight easier. Like in the second Sandman fight, you had to turn the valve and increase the water pressure so the water would explode so you could trap Sandman in the water and inflict damage. These fights were a lot more thought out and made you think a bit more than before. You can't just run up to the enemy and just hit away without getting hit with some counterattack because you didn't think about what to do for the actual fight itself. Unfortunately, knowing what to do to defeat the boss is ambiguous just like the levels themselves, and in order to figure it out, you just gotta try different things. Like in the final fight against Electro, you can see that you need to disable his device, but how do you do that? The game doesn't give you any hints, you just have to listen to what Peter says and put the pieces together. That fight is easily the best fight in the game, by the way. Nonetheless, the boss fights were definitely improved and fit what was going on within the story. The gameplay for this game is definitely improved from the first one, but the camera issues alongside the poor level design hinders the gameplay experience. It makes the game much harder to play than it actually is. I admire the ambition the devs had when creating the game, but the final result just didn't live up to what it could have been. Just like the original, there is plenty of side content to keep you busy after finishing the main story. As I mentioned earlier, there is the training mode where you can learn everything you need to know about the mechanics of the game. There's a costume section like before, but this time there's different costumes, like Venom 2 Earth X, Negative Zone, and others, giving you more suits for future replays. New to this game is a feature called Create a Spider, where you could create your own Spider-Man with his own skin plus various powers. This was a cool feature as you could craft a Spider-Man that suits your specific style of gameplay or how you wanted to play the game. Again, there is a character viewer, where you can see all the characters that appear in the game, narrated by Stan Lee, just like in the original.
Fugitive William Baker hid from the law in an atomic test range, where a freak accident turned him into the Sandman. Once a two-bit thug, until he had an adamantium plate implanted in his head, Hammerhead now rules the Mafia with an iron hand.
The comic book covers return as well, but this time with new comic covers from Peter Parker's journey as Spider-Man. If you unlock all of them, you can see that number 23, The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, 2001 Annual, was the cover for the first game. Seeing this cover was a nice nod to the first, but could easily be missed if you don't unlock the cover. The Parker Portfolio section contains pictures of the boss fights that occur during the story. They're nothing over the top, but it's nice art to look at. And finally, you can still enter cheat codes just like in the original. I really wish cheats would come back in games today, even if they're just for vanity items or gameplay effects. Cheats really helped improve the replay value with some of these older titles. Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro is a sequel that tried to do a lot of things, some done well, others not so much. Regardless, it takes the foundation that was created from the first and improves upon it, making for a fresh but familiar experience that all Spider-Man fans will enjoy. Even with the drawbacks with the camera and level design, this game is still worth a playthrough. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7 out of 10. This game is fun, but misses the mark in some areas and doesn't hold the same charm as the original one does. Playing this game decades later after its release has shown me why this game gets overshadowed by the first. Unfortunately, I think this is one of those rare cases where the original game is better than the sequel. So after the release of Vicarious Vision's Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro, they decided to make a sequel, but not for the PlayStation 2, but for the Game Boy Advance. Going from a console to a handheld was definitely an interesting decision, so based off this decision, you can assume that this game was substantially worse, right? Well, I'm happy to tell you that is not the case. So since this was a handheld title, going into this game I kept my expectations in check. I was under the assumption that this game would be absolutely terrible, but to my surprise, this was a quality Game Boy Advance game. At its core, the story is pretty basic for this game. You start off with a conversation between Peter and Mary Jane, where she asks him to buy her a new fishbowl for their fish. As he leaves to go and buy the fishbowl, he sees TV reports of criminal activity happening downtown. In addition, the police won't comment on if the events are connected or not, so, to nobody's surprise, we take off immediately, throw on the suit, and go put a stop to these crimes. Now this is when we are shown the map, which displays each level that you can go to by moving from dot to dot, each representing a different place. You go through 7 different levels, with each having you face a villain at the end in order to complete the stage. Now let's start off with the first level, downtown. Immediately from the first level, I noticed the beautiful colors and environment. For a Game Boy Advance game, this looks surprisingly good. I knew from the comic book style cutscenes that the game would be colorful, but I didn't think it would look this great. But still, we move forward from rooftop to rooftop while fighting different enemies. The devs did a great job at making Spider-Man flexible with his movements, as you can jump and punch, but if you hit the down or up button and then press attack, Spidey will perform different attacks like a low leg kick or a leaping kick. In addition, you can shoot webs using web fluid. What's cool is that you can angle the shots in the way that you want them to go. So if the enemy is above you, you can shoot your webs up, just adding more ways that you can kill the enemies. The enemies are a lot more aggressive than I expected, as if you get close to them, they perform melee attacks that are hard to dodge from close range. In addition, these Mafia-styled enemies use guns and can shoot you from long range, always keeping you on your toes. Since there was Mafia guys all throughout this level, it was no surprise that we fight Hammerhead at the end of the level. During these boss fights, I recommend using everything at your arsenal to defeat these bosses because they're pretty tough. Hammerhead stands at a distance while performing a couple of different attacks, which include using his gun, using his head as a battering ram to run through you, and calling henchmen to come kill you. After finishing this fight, we get jumped by more of Hammerhead's men as he flees to the nightclub. For a first level, I thought this set the tone of the game really well, and the story was intriguing enough that it held my attention. So we go to the nightclub to hunt down Hammerhead, and which is easily my favorite level in the game. We start by talking to this civilian that lets us know that mobsters are holding some hostages within the club and we need to free them. When we enter the club, we start in a different part of the building where we encounter the Mafia thugs once again. As we continue forward, there are doors that we had to go through, which would lead us to more enemies that once we killed them, it would free the hostage in the area. The actual club itself looked cool, with all the different colors blending together to create the perfect club aesthetic. One thing worth mentioning is that you have to pay attention when you're in these levels, because if you don't remember where you went previously, you'll keep running in circles as you search for the exit to move on. After freeing all the hostages, we fight Hammerhead once again. Just like the last fight, he has the same attacks with him shooting the gun, running and charging, and calling henchmen. After putting a stop to him, we find out that someone hired him to move some laser transmitters. Now that Hammerhead was stopped, it was time to move on to the next level, Pier 54. This level was similar to the first as we had the Night City background, but we were closer to the actual city streets. The enemies were muscular thugs who weren't carrying weapons, but could perform quick melee attacks that could cause some serious damage if you're not careful. This level featured sections where there was water on the ground, so you had to be careful when swinging across when trying to get to the next area. Here's when I realized how useful the other suits were. If you searched high and low throughout the levels, you could find power-ups that were actually suits that would make the combat so much easier. At the end of the level, we fight Rhino, who was tricky as he would constantly run from side to side, trying to ram you or slam the wall, inflicting damage to you as you fall down. Once I started jumping over Rhino, I was able to hit away and end this fight. After his defeat, we pull Rhino out of the water and find out that Rhino was just distracting the cops so a shipment of crates could be delivered to the museum. Once we realize that Rhino doesn't know much, we go to the museum. Similar to the nightclub, when we enter the museum, we have to travel through multiple doors in order to find artifacts that will lead us to the final boss. This time the enemies changed, as they weren't normal thugs, but they looked like armored thugs that carried guns alongside ninjas. If you defeated the yellow ninjas, their bodies would dissipate and drop an artifact. Once you had acquired all 5 artifacts, it was time for the boss fight, Scorpion. Now here is when the boss fights really started to ramp up in difficulty. During this fight, Scorpion would move around constantly and attack using his stinger, which was really hard to dodge. He just kept hopping from one side of the room to the next, so when I was able to close the distance, I made sure to attack as much as I could. After a bit of a struggle, we defeat Scorpion and find out that he was expecting a shipment from the docks, and in return, he would receive the tech he needs to get out of his suit. After opening the crates, we find a holographic projector and move on to the 5th level, Empire Metals. If you made it this far, then by now you probably know how this goes. Travel up and down, go through the arrow doors, and find the boss. This level took the traversing to an even higher level as there was fire on the ground that could kill you if touched, and started having enemies placed on top of certain objects that made going from place to place a huge pain. The enemies were more of the same too, with them being ninjas and thugs with guns. The boss for this level was a surprise as it was Big Wheel. His fight wasn't hard at all, as you could just stand at a distance and hit him with your web blast, as his wheel is so large it's almost impossible to miss him. After spamming the web blast, we defeat this villain and find out that he was just a distraction so that the power core at ChemCorp could be fully drained. After hearing this, we head straight to the next level, ChemCorp. I didn't know what to expect entering this level, but after finishing this, it's safe to say that this is by far the hardest level in the game. The formula is still the same. You still have to find exits throughout the level to progress, but this time you have to go all over the place in order to find out where to go. This stage has you constantly going up and down, crawling all over objects, and being forced to swing across very narrow spaces to continue forward. The most frustrating part was how there are sections where you have to swing up and under spaces to avoid electrical circuits which would electrocute you, making you fall down and lose some health. There are multiple sections like this in this level, and it took me so many tries to finally get across. After a lot of struggle, we finally get to the boss, Electro. This fight wasn't too difficult as you just needed to run up on him and close the distance quick. If you let him hover around, he will go on top of the platform and zap everything or make electric shockwaves on the ground. After taking down Electro, we learned that all the villains were just gathering parts to create holographic transmitters that created illusions across the city. After putting the pieces together, we realized that Mysterio is the one behind all the crime that has been happening downtown. Knowing this info, we go and start the final level in the game, the amusement park. Starting this level off, we begin outside in the amusement park fighting a whole bunch of clowns. The clowns were a lot faster than I expected, as they could just run right by you while hitting you with a quick attack. We then go underground into what looks like a haunted house as we fight skeletons and see coffins littered on every floor. Just like the previous level, there's a lot of up and down movement with many crevices and hidden floors. Finally, after a long struggle, we fight the last and hardest fight in the game, Mysterio. Mysterio is actually pretty tough. He cycles through a couple of attacks which include him having a magical force field which leaves him and hits you, then creating clones of himself that has the same force field that attacks you, and then turning himself into past villains from other levels and using their attacks to cause damage. In order to win this fight, you have to dodge all the force field attacks and then web up Mysterio so you can attack away. After a handful of tries, Mysterio is defeated and he vanishes before we're able to send him to the police. We go and get MJ or Fishbowl, and finally the game is complete. Before I end this video, I have to mention the music. The OST for this game was on a whole nother level. The theme for every level was unique and fit the environment we were playing in. What's funny is that the select level theme where you chose each stage is my favorite theme in the whole game. The music was so well done and really helped add to the atmosphere of each level during my time playing the game. Overall, Spider-Man Mysterio's Menace is a great sequel to Enter Electro even though it's on the Game Boy Advance. The combination of its simplistic story but engaging gameplay make for a quick and satisfying Spider-Man experience. If you still have a Game Boy Advance lying around, then I definitely recommend giving this game a try, as it can be beaten pretty fast. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7.5 out of 10. This title isn't without some minor issues, but it's still worth your time, especially if you're a big Spider-Man fan like myself.
Mr. Osborn, are you alright?
So if you've seen the movie, which I'm assuming if you click this video, then you most definitely have, the story is based off the events that occurred throughout the film with some extra fluff added in to make the game longer. What I thought was interesting was how you start off playing as Peter as you search for Uncle Ben's killer. For some reason, I thought you played a little bit before that part, but to my surprise, you receive a recap of the wrestling match versus Bonesaw and the robbery soon after. When you're scouring the rooftops fighting Skull gang members, it reminded me of Neversoft's Spider-Man 1 for the PlayStation 1, as going from rooftop to rooftop fighting enemies was all too familiar. We eventually find our way to the warehouse where we hunt down and find Uncle Ben's killer. This game did a good job at depicting what happened in the movie at the most important times.
No! You! Not you!
Stay back! I'm warning you, you psycho!
I could have stopped you at the fight promoter's office. I could have saved Uncle Ben.
Like, they could have had us actually kill Uncle Ben's killer instead of having him trip out the window like they did in the movie. Decisions like this really just made it feel like you were going through the actual movie even though you were playing the game. It was great to see Norman Osborn outside of the suit and inside the lab trying to develop the super soldier serum. The models in this game are far from perfect, but they're good enough that you can tell which character was which. Going through this story, I actually found myself wondering when Goblin was going to show up, because I couldn't remember at which point he actually entered the game. With us fighting Shocker, Vulture, and Scorpion, I started to realize that I actually didn't remember anything about this game. Now, me not remembering a lot I didn't think was a bad thing. I was just shocked by how I couldn't remember anything. It really has just been that long.
Too bad Peter had to work.
Yeah. I'm just glad you're here. I can't wait for my dad to meet you.
Oh, Harry.
After defeating this handful of villains, we finally fight Goblin for the first time at the Oscorp Unity Day Festival, which is a memorable moment from the movie, and that fight definitely doesn't disappoint. This fight felt like it lasted forever though, as after saving MJ you fight Goblin for a good minute until he offers Spider-Man to join him. By this point in the story, I was wondering how much longer we had left to go since we had already fought multiple villains in Goblin once. But once again, this game surprised me as we traveled to Oscorp to investigate a piece of Goblin's equipment. Before I continue on with this story, I've gotta say that this Oscorp laboratory section is by far the hardest part in this game. If you played this game before, then you know exactly what I'm talking about, but I digress. Even though this wasn't in the movie, I thought it was cool to actually find out that Oscorp contains secret labs for making chemical weapons and a giant robot, making the trek through the level worth it after all. At the end of our time at Oscorp, we discovered that Goblin knows about MJ after seeing the photograph of them kissing. To nobody's surprise, Goblin then decides to kidnap her.
What a day.
Tough day at the office, huh? Mine is a killer. Put your heart into those streams, my lovely girl, the better to bait my trap.
We finally arrive at the final battle where we save MJ and fight Goblin. One interesting difference is that the entire sequence plays out on the bridge instead of going to the abandoned building where Goblin eventually dies. Now, one part I did think was funny is that when Goblin calls in the glider to hit Spider-Man, when it hits Goblin instead, it just takes him all the way across the bridge. He just flies. I just thought that was so funny, as when in the movie, it just hits him and he just goes right up against the wall. A nice little change, but it's still funny nonetheless.
Mr. Osborn. Why?
Surprised? Yes, I suppose you would be. But the best surprise is still to come.
After Norman dies, MJ then kisses us without removing the mask, which was weird, and then the game was over, with Peter telling us to
go outside and play.
Since the story is based off the movie, there isn't much that comes as a surprise, but it was nice to see the additional story beats with the villains that added to the overall world. I thought the balance and tone was done well too, as it was always serious with what everything was going on, but the dialogue between Peter and the villains, along with the terrible voice acting by everyone not named Willem Dafoe, actually made this game even more enjoyable. But nonetheless, let's move on to the gameplay. Now, one thing I do have to say is that this game is very hard. It doesn't matter who you're fighting, where you're fighting them, how much health you have, what moves you think you know, you can get swarmed by enemies like that and just die instantly. And then to make matters worse, Goblin is like a freaking Mortal Kombat character. He knows all these freaking fancy moves and flips and kicks, and it's hard to even close the distance and fight him. But nonetheless, let's just go into this gameplay and I'll explain further. The normal enemies aren't difficult one-on-one, but if they swarm you, it can get rough. They take more damage than you would think, and you can't just focus on one enemy, you have to keep track of what they're all doing just to make sure you can survive. What helped me was performing the 2 web moves by pressing triangle and the left or right directional buttons. If you moved it to the left, you sprayed webbing on your fists, making punches a lot stronger. If you moved it to the right, you would create a web dome, which would put you in a protective shield and blast the enemies around you, perfect for dealing with the crowds. Normally, it would take a couple combos to defeat the enemies, but with these web fists, they go down after 1 or 2 hits. Now they do take a second or 2 to charge up, but if you're able to find the time to actually charge these, then you can use them effectively in almost every fight. The Shocker, Vulture, and Scorpion boss fights were all unique, and I appreciated that each fight served as some sort of build-up that led to the final confrontation. When you're in the train station trying to dodge Shocker's blast, it made you think quick, so you could time where you had to be so you knew you would have the opportunity to move. His actual fight wasn't too hard, as you could either just punch away or just wait for him to tire himself out and then just go in and inflict some damage. Vulture was another cool villain I didn't expect to show up either. And let me tell you something, climbing up Vulture's tower was a huge pain. It wasn't enough that the tower was on fire, there was missing parts on the stairs, so you had to go in every direction in order to ascend to the top. And on top of that, there were the drones that would follow you and explode if you got too close. After all that struggling getting to the top of the tower, once we finally get there, Vulture just flies out. This led us to a chase sequence in the Vulture boss fight. This boss fight really emphasized the amount of effort the devs put into the aerial combat, because I was impressed with how much fun it was to fight in the air. Obviously, it's not really fast or fluid, but you could see signs of what the air combat would become with your ability to not only web from above, but perform combos as well. Now this next part had me kinda confused, because here we are running into Scorpion and I'm thinking, alright, bring it Scorpion, what's up? And then we end up protecting him. Having to protect Scorpion just felt weird, but not in a bad way, more like uncharted territory. It was refreshing to actually protect a villain instead of fighting them for once, even if it was just for one level. Once we do fight Scorpion, he was even harder than the previous 2 fights, as he doesn't just hit you with his tail, he can dash across the station and perform what looks like hyper beam attacks. What made this fight so frustrating is that the beam attacks were deadly accurate, being able to hit you even if you were swinging in different directions. How I managed to win was taking the objects around the area and just throwing them at him until he ran out of health. You can try getting in close and hitting him, but I don't see how you'll survive. So now, let's finally discuss the worst level in the game, Oscorp. This level can be so frustrating at times, so bad to the point that I could see players dropping the game because of how annoying it is. First off, you have to be stealthy the whole time so you can't be seen by anybody that could raise the alarm. So, me being me, I'm thinking, man, I'm just gonna swing right through it. I don't care about no alarm, these guards can't catch me. Man, that was a mistake, because it turns out that the guards that were patrolling each area are actually super soldiers because they take a lot more hits than normal enemies, and if you didn't finish them fast, they would run to the alarm box and alert these annoying robots. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna have nightmares about these robots, as when they come after you, they swarm you. It's not just one, it can be like 5 or more, with more spawning as you enter each room. The lasers that shoot at you deal great damage and they take a couple hits to kill, making them a huge pain to get rid of. Now there is a way out of this if you're patient, which I'm not. If you hide in the shadows, your mask will turn black, indicating that you can't be seen. So if you're able to hide in the dark while the alarm is raised, then the robots won't be able to spot you. But of course, if you hide in the dark near the robots, they will just see right through it and kill you anyways. But wait, it gets even worse. The map layout of Oscorp is literally a giant maze, making this even more difficult. It's not just a couple of hallways, there are various rooms and doors leading to different objects and enemies that could ruin your whole run if you're not paying attention. Having to navigate this building while being stealthy and avoiding everyone in there, it was just tedious, and if I replay this game again, best believe I'm using cheat codes to skip this entire section. And finally we fight Goblin. Twice.
Fool, I've offered you the world and you've thrown it away. Well, I'll cure you of your deluded ideals soon enough.
Save it. You're done.
That's what you think. I've arranged for a little parting gift.
The first fight at the Unity Day Festival showed me that Goblin is no joke. When you fight him in the air, he moves really fast on the glider and is constantly going back and forth on the screen while throwing pumpkin bombs and those flying bat things that could just cut you up. I forget what they're called, but these things. Then, when you get him on the ground, the fights are even more difficult, as trying to land a hit on this man is damn near impossible. As soon as you get close to him, he would just punch and kick you first, or grab you and throw you around, or pick you up and choke the life out you. What worked for me was doing nothing but kicks, as it seemed to break his usual attack pattern and allowed me to get a combo or two in. I'll say this again, if you're playing this game on hero or superhero, kudos to you, because you're a beast, because I couldn't do it. I just played this game on normal and it was still really hard. It doesn't matter where you're fighting Goblin, in the sky or on the ground, you better buckle in for a tough fight because he doesn't pull any punches. Because of the difficulty, it was very satisfying to see Goblin get impaled with that glider, because at that point, I was just happy the fight was over. The gameplay for this game is drastically improved over the PS1 Spider-Man games, and it's clear that this game laid the foundation for how the combat would eventually become in the more recent installment of Spider-Man games. Now this game does have some replayability, as there are some cool extras that are worth checking out after you beat the game. You can choose to do this legit or through the secret shop, but regardless, you can play as other characters other than Spider-Man. By far the best character to play as was Green Goblin, as if you start up a mission when you're outside the city, you can use his glider to fly around and attack the thugs on top of the buildings, as well as jump off the glider and fight them one-on-one. Goblin has his own moveset and can run extremely fast, making him just as much fun or even more fun than Spider-Man. It was really cool that the devs let him become a playable character after you beat the game. Shocker is playable as well, but he doesn't have any different attacks. It's pretty much just a Shocker skin, but you use Spider-Man's abilities, which is pretty weird to see. There is a production art section where you can view various concept arts for the game, including characters, environments, and iconic moments shown throughout the story. Overall, this game was so much fun to revisit and was just as fun as I remember as a kid. Outside of the Oscorp level, there really wasn't anything I disliked about the game. Every aspect of the game, from the combat to the cutscenes and the story, they were improved from the older games, making for a solid adaptation of the 2002 film. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game an 8 out of 10. If you're a fan of Spider-Man and have a way to play this game, I would recommend giving this a playthrough, as it's a short game, but it's definitely worth your time.
And this is Mary Jane, the girl next door, the girl I love. But love is a tricky thing when you live part of your life behind a mask. Fate handed me amazing powers, and I made a promise to use those powers to help people. With great power comes great responsibility. No matter how much I might wish things were different, there's only one Spider-Man.
One thing this game does really well is adding extra content outside of what happened during the movie. If you've seen Spider-Man 2, then you already know how this goes, but we start off 2 years after the events of Spider-Man 1, as we see Peter struggling to balance his personal life while also fulfilling his duty as Spider-Man. Early on in the game, we meet with Harry and MJ, where immediately you can see how much better Tobey's voice acting is compared to the first. In the first game, he just sounded like he didn't want to be there. In addition, Kirsten Dunst voices MJ and Alfred Molina voices Doc Ock, which definitely helps add to the immersion, even though sometimes MJ doesn't sound like MJ. Regardless, Harry blames Spider-Man for his father's death, and the tension between them continues to grow. I gotta be honest though, I like Black Cat more in this game than I did Mary Jane. Black Cat appears over and over during the course of the story and really helps Peter while he's struggling to find his footing in his personal life. Her sections where you fight crime, race, and fight Shocker definitely kept the game fresh and helped keep the game flowing at a good pace. It was cool to see Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio, given so much screen time as we have to participate in various games to prove that we're the real Spider-Man, and fight him with his drones in order to save the city. In my opinion, the Mysterio sections were by far the worst part of the game. That's just me though. Just like in the movie, Dr. Octavius' experiment goes wrong and he ends up damaging the inhibitor chip that was protecting his brain. What was great was that the demonstration scene was a playable section as you had to turn off the generators that were powering the device. This wasn't easy as the bursts from the fusion reactor would fly you across the room if you were hit by them. A small addition, but this really helped elevate the story. As I got deeper into the story, I know they altered some of the events that happened in the movie. Like I found myself sitting there like, wait, that didn't happen like this, and that didn't happen like that. But it didn't hinder the experience, it was just something I noticed. For example, later on, Doc Ock confronts Kirk Connors, which he never does in the movie. We only see Kirk Connors when Peter is arriving late for his college classes.
Get away from me, you traitor. What? Yeah. He wants to turn me into the police. Is this how you repay my friendship? Yes, of course. That murderous arachnid Spider-Man. He killed Rosie. Destroyed my life's work in an instant. I'll rebuild it, though, and kill him.
Just like in the movie, we get the bank scene where Doc Ock tries to rob a bank to fund his recreation of the fusion machine. The dialogue is a bit off, but it's close enough to make you feel like you're really in the moment. Now here is where I realized how flawed those Doc Ock fights were, but we'll get to that soon enough. Again, what was really cool was after completing a main story mission that was present in the movie, we were sidetracked and went after Shocker, who had escaped from prison during our little competition with Mysterio. The placement of the extra content during the story is timed perfectly, making it feel like you weren't just breezing right through the movie events. A little bit later, we get tossed by Doc Ock in the cafe and then find him on the train just like in the film. Now I don't know much about game development, but I was impressed how well they did the scene where Doc enters the cafe. For the devs to accurately depict Ock destroying the cafe and throwing Peter around was really impressive, considering the hardware they were working with at the time. Nonetheless, we fight Ock on the train only to pass out and end up at Harry's place where we tell him we have to find MJ. This moment didn't hold any weight like the movie, but it was nice to see this shown in video game form. This leads us to the final confrontation with Ock at the abandoned building on the waterfront, which served as the most frustrating fight of the entire game. Story-wise, it stayed true to the movie and saw Ock sacrifice himself to undo the mess he had caused and finally set things right. As we swing off into the distance after kissing MJ, I was satisfied with how the story was told in the game and thought they did a solid job of recapping the events while straying off the path just enough to keep you intrigued in regards to what would come next. Now, let's move on to the gameplay. The gameplay is where this game excels. It's leaps and bounds above any previous Spider-Man game before it, and I think this is the main reason why I love this game in the first place. First, let's start off with the web swinging. The web swinging in this game is so fast and fluid you're damn near flying across the entire map, making all the time trials and time missions a cakewalk. What's even better is that when you use the webs, you actually have to stick to something instead of just webbing up into the sky like in the original Spider-Man. If you didn't have a building or an object to web on, then Spider-Man would just jump up in the air and you weren't going anywhere. These small attention to details made a huge difference. The open world concept that we saw signs of in prior games was finally realized in this title, as you could go anywhere across New York City and it really felt like you could stop crime anywhere at any time. There was always plenty to do outside of the main story missions, and it was never a chore to reach these places since the web swinging was so good. All of these things to do in the world was just the icing on the cake. The minigames and crimes are really what make this game addicting. To start off with, delivering pizzas is one of the funnest minigames in video game history. It's so simple but yet challenges you as the placement of each delivery gets further away and requires faster web swinging as you finish each pizza level. I spent hours just completing each level, and I can only pray that we get to see this minigame in a future Spider-Man title because it's just that good. The trials that this game had were fun, as they had you completing certain objectives that would reward you with skill points that would allow you to buy new abilities and help you in traversal and combat. I would say out of all the aspects in this game, these little challenges had the least replayability, but they were still pretty fun. As you would swing around the city, there were always citizens that needed help. These were represented by green icons that were all over the map. Once you approached a person, they would report the crime and then you would have to stop it. What's so great is that there was a variety of crimes that would happen and you weren't just doing the same crime over and over again. Yeah, like, most of them consisted of beating up thugs, but who doesn't like to do that? Other activities that people would have you take on is like taking injured people to the hospital, catching balloons that little kids had lost, and saving construction workers from falling off the buildings. When you combine all the mini games on top of the story missions, there is always something to do, so I was never bored during my playthrough. Now the actual combat itself is really fun. Fighting the thugs and bosses just felt like I really was Spider-Man, as you could buy combos from the comic book shops located around the city to unlock new moves to use against your enemies. Once you realize which combos to perform on what enemies, the combat just opened up, as you could perform a variety of different moves depending on the situation. And I'm very happy to say that the boss fights in this game were nowhere near as hard as they were in Spider-Man 1. But there were still two situations that were a huge pain. First, the Mysterios sections after completing the arena games were just terrible. Like, why did we have to swing across the city and then across the river only to web up onto these UFO beacon objects? It's like the devs wanted us to play on the Statue of Liberty, so they just threw this together so we would be able to play over in that area. When we actually get there, it was a huge pain to try and get high enough in the air to swing over to each orb and destroy those so we could eliminate the main thing in the middle. To make matters worse, if you were too slow, the orbs would just regenerate, forcing you to destroy them all over again. I just thought this whole section was unnecessary and could have just been done on the ground, but I do admire the vision regarding the level creation. I just think the execution could have been done a lot better. Now let's move on to these boss fights, especially the Doc Ock fights. I went into this game thinking he was going to be semi-difficult, but nah, this man was just as hard as Green Goblin. Each time you fight him, the game tells you to web up his tentacles when he attacks to pin them down so you can run off some combos. What makes it difficult is that he performs a whole bunch of different moves, so even when you use your webs, they may not even stick to the arms. To make matters worse, you have to web up each individual tentacle. You can't just web up all the arms together, making the whole process even more tedious. Let's just say you web up an arm or two. You then had to web up the other arms fast enough so that those arms would stay down before the other arms would break free from the webbing, and you'd have to repeat the whole process over again. The way I was able to defeat this man was by waiting for him to perform specific moves with the arms that would put them close to the ground. So when I was using the webs, they would make the arms stick to the ground immediately. If you tried webbing the arms while Ock was in the air, it was almost impossible to tie them all up. On the surface, he isn't a hard boss, it's just the mechanics of how to defeat him could have been done so much better. If I had to choose a favorite boss, it would probably be Shocker, as his fights weren't annoying but challenging enough to force you to pay attention and figure out how to defeat him. His fights were even more fun because we had Black Cat with us, helping us during the battle. Finally, there's one more thing that I gotta mention. There's this part where you have to fight these thugs in giant green machines alongside Black Cat. That combat section was just as hard now as it was when I was a kid. You have like 4 or 5 of these giant machines you gotta take out that have a really high defense. And to make matters worse, there's a bunch of normal thugs shooting at you while you fight the machines. This section took me a minute to get through, as I have no idea how I beat that part as a kid. Overall, this game still holds up and is a fantastic Spider-Man experience. Even with the outdated graphics and some annoying gameplay segments, this title is still a blast to play. With all that being said, I'm going to give this game an 8 out of 10. Returning back to this game so many years later made me realize that even though this game is good, nostalgia really can blind you to some of the issues that are apparent in some of these older games. Regardless, if you haven't played this game, I would definitely recommend this, just for the pizza minigame alone, and then you have the actual story on top of that. But now that I finished this playthrough, I think I can confidently say that this is no longer my favorite Spider-Man game. It's still great, but after playing Spider-Man 2018, there's no way I can put that above this game. Years ago, back during the PS2 Xbox generation, we got a bunch of Spider-Man games, and along the way we got 2 titles made specifically for handhelds, which were Spider-Man Mysterios Menace and Spider-Man Battle for New York. For some reason, I forgot to play Battle for New York before doing my Ultimate Spider-Man review, so I decided to take a bit of time to finally give this game a try, and honestly, I wish I wouldn't have. This game released on both the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS, but the version I chose to play was the Game Boy Advance. I didn't think there'd be that big of a difference, so I just decided to go with the Game Boy since that was one of my favorite handhelds from back in the day. Regardless, this game plays just like other Game Boy games you may have gone through yourself. You play as not only Spider-Man, but Goblin as well, with the game having you complete objectives before finding an exit in order to finish the level. I'm not sure if you could quite call this a side-scroller, but just like most Game Boy games, the entrances and exits are found at the far ends of the screen. Specifically in this game, the exits are easy to find since there's a giant green arrow that you can't possibly miss. Unfortunately, this game gets repetitive really fast. It doesn't matter which character you're playing as, what you're doing within each level is very similar and doesn't change too much. As you move from level to level, most of the time your objectives will be to find switches, destroy generators, place cameras, and other mundane tasks. I understand this is a handheld, so I kept my expectations low, but even still, this game could have had a bit more variety in terms of the objectives you needed to complete within each specific mission. Thankfully, once you finish a level or set of levels, you'll encounter a boss fight that actually requires a little bit of thought. I liked how these boss fights weren't just against any old enemy, but were against iconic Spider-Man villains and characters. Just like the console games, you would meet these enemies during the story, and then the next thing you know, you're thrust right into a boss fight. The actual fights themselves don't hold your hand either, but instead require you to try out different things and test them out to see what works. The enemies perform the same actions over and over, and once you find out how to damage them, the fights are more manageable. The hardest parts of the fights are just discovering how to inflict damage, not the actual bosses themselves. I mentioned that you can play as both Spider-Man and Goblin. Once you get a hold of each character, you'll see that they play the same, but different. Each of them has the ability to jump and grab surfaces, but in my opinion, the movement is so much better when playing as Spider-Man. After angling your jump correctly, Spider-Man will automatically attach onto the ledge, allowing him to crawl all around it. However, Goblin only grabs the ledge but can't move up and down once he grabs it. You can jump up and jump down along the ledge, but it's not nearly as smooth. This limits the movement drastically when playing as Goblin because this game has tons of platforming as you're constantly going in all directions. In regards to the combat, it's smoother than I expected. You can inflict damage to your opponents using a combination of your power and physical attacks. Both characters are able to perform basic combos like punches and kicks, and to do those, all you have to do is input the B button. The hardest part about executing the combos is trying to close the distance on the enemies to do so. Most of the time, the guards and soldiers all have guns and shoot range attacks, which makes it hard to get in close and hit them. Because of this, most of the time I would just jump over the enemies or use the character's powers instead. Goblin's power is essentially shooting fireballs, which I thought was pretty cool. By pressing the R button, you can spam the power until your power meter runs out. But to my surprise, you can change the type of fireball that Goblin shoots by pressing the L button. This can be seen in the top right corner, and it's a nice switch up if you get tired of shooting the same fireball over and over. Personally, I use the same one over and over because it's really strong, but honestly, it's up to the player to which they prefer. As expected, Spider-Man's power was his webs. You press the same button, but what makes his web so good is that it can tie up the enemies and give you time to close the distance, which I mentioned earlier is hard to do. Similar to Mysterios' Menace, you can aim your web in different directions so you can web items above you or below you, giving you more options than just shooting left and right. It's worth noting that Spider-Man can use his webs to swing across the levels, which is actually a lot faster than I expected. Like if you spam the A button, you'll move pretty quickly and stay high above the enemies. So if you start getting tired of running from place to place, there's always another means of transportation available. I don't know if it was just me, but I thought this game was really hard. I'm not sure if it was because the game is dated or it's a skill issue, but I struggled in this game a lot. The platforming isn't the best, and to make matters worse, there's always an enemy on top of the ledge that will hit you, sending you back down to wherever you came from. And these aren't always melee attacks either, as when you finally reach the top of the ledge, you can be hit from a beam attack from an enemy with a gun that's only a couple feet away. In my opinion, the health drops were dispersed well for Spider-Man, but done really poorly for Goblin. As Spider-Man, you can find drops in small nooks and crannies all over the level, and the enemies drop them here and there after destroying them. But for Goblin, you barely got any drops at all. This made the game so much more difficult than it needed to be. You could easily run through 20 enemies, but let's say you run into some lasers or traps a couple times, you're going to be in some trouble. If you're lucky, you'll find one health or power drop while completing an objective, but more than likely you'll be restarting the levels over and over. Since I played Ultimate Spider-Man before this game, I find it funny that the lack of drops was apparent in this title and in that game, because that was one of the few gripes I had in Ultimate Spider-Man. I thought that issue was a one-off, but now I see where it came from. One thing this game did extremely well was mixing up the environments and locations. Just like Mysterios Menace, all the levels are in different places or in different sections in the same place. All of the locations look just as they should, like they belonged inside the Spider-Man world. It could just be me, but I'm a sucker for those old school graphics which have everything looking like animated sprites. It just has a nostalgic feel to them, and it's the same way in this game. When fighting the enemies or completing the objectives, the game is almost always a joy to look at. That's pretty much it for the gameplay. If you're a fan of platforming and like fighting off tons of enemies, then you'll catch on to this pretty fast. But I'd be lying if I said this game was easy. The level design is really repetitive, and if you start dying a lot, I don't blame you for using cheats or dropping the game altogether. The story for this game is pretty simple, as it serves as a prequel to Ultimate Spider-Man. At first it may not seem like it's a prequel, but when the game opens up you see Norman Osborn take the Oz formula and turn into Goblin. But the Goblin we see is from the Ultimate Spider-Man universe, not the Goblin that we're used to from the comics and the Sam Raimi Spider-Man games that came before it. Even still, it was refreshing to revisit this universe because there isn't a lot of media that takes place with this specific Spider-Man. Along the way you'll see familiar characters and the plot goes about the way you would think. Predictable, but entertaining. The thing that may take you out of the immersion completely is the fact that the cutscenes have no music and no voice acting. So every time you finish a level, you're pretty much just reading PowerPoint slides. You can tell that effort was put into the story because the dialogue is more than just a couple words. You have to actually scroll multiple pages and slides to fully grasp what's exactly going on. What I liked was the introduction of other Spider-Man characters from the universe, but how they were introduced was held back simply due to the hardware the game was created on. It didn't matter if you played on the Game Boy or the DS, the other characters outside of Goblin just weren't fleshed out enough as they should have been. Regardless, I appreciate the effort the devs took to try to make this game seem less repetitive, because they could have just used Goblin in every scene. Honestly, I thought this story was forgettable and it just seemed like more of a setup for Ultimate Spider-Man. I'm gonna say that if you were to play this game and not read a single cutscene, you would still enjoy your time with it because the additional context this story provides is not that substantial. Overall, Spider-Man Battle for New York is one of my least favorite Spider-Man titles. I don't know if it's because I played the Game Boy version over the DS version, but this game just feels skippable. Like, I'd be lying if there was one legit reason why you should ever play this game outside the fact that if you like Spider-Man, you might enjoy this. The gameplay is dated, the level design is repetitive, and the payoff with the cutscenes don't justify the struggle you go through to get to them. So should you play this in 2024? The answer is absolutely not. I think this is one of those games that was probably really good if you were able to play it during your childhood. Like if you were in the car or on the bus and had your Game Boy or DS, this would be a perfect game to boot up and play. If you were to ask me my score for this game, I'd probably give it a 5.5. Cause even 20 years later, this game ain't it. So if you're just hearing about this for the first time, my recommendation would be just to skip this and go straight to Ultimate Spider-Man, because you're really not missing much. Since the story is set in the Ultimate Marvel Universe, it was nice to not remember exactly how everything had happened. Because this game isn't based off a movie, I didn't just know what was going to happen next because I remembered a plot point from the movie. This helped make the story feel brand new since I haven't played this in so many years. So to start off, we get a recap of how Venom came to be, and we see Peter don the black suit before eventually taking it off. Well-known stuff that most Spider-Man fans already know. We then play a fight between Peter and Venom on a rainy football field before Venom is supposedly killed by a falling power line.
Lie on the ground with your hands over your head. Both of you! On the ground now! The hell is that?
Right from the beginning, I loved how well Venom was depicted. He truly felt like a monster that was difficult to take down. We'll talk more about Venom later though. We then get a 3-month time skip, where everything seems normal and it's revealed to us that Eddie is actually alive and well, with us finding out that he's been feeding on people, obviously due to him still being bonded to the symbiote. One thing worth mentioning is that you never hear anybody refer to Venom as the symbiote, it's just called the suit. I don't know if it's just because of the universe this story takes place in, but it was kinda weird to see it called that. After seeing how Peter's life has progressed, we switch over to Eddie where we learn Venom's gameplay mechanics and how to use them. Once learning the controls, we start causing some damage and then damage a bike right outside of a bar, leading to one of the most memorable fights in the game.
Holy!
Nice mess. Hunger. insane.
This Wolverine fight is the one thing I remembered from my time playing it as a kid. This whole situation is funny because prior to this we had absolutely no idea that Wolverine was even in the city, and then he just pops out of nowhere claiming that we damaged his bike. Of course, Venom being Venom, we take him down and move on. Now switching back to Peter, him and Mary Jane are studying when she tells him that Rhino is on the loose. I thought it was interesting that she just made it seem like Rhino was no big deal and we could just put him down in a couple minutes. Anyways, we chase Rhino throughout the city before fighting him in a random parking lot. It's worth noting that there are a lot of chase sequences throughout the game. Almost every time you encounter a new boss, you have to chase him throughout the city first. I didn't mind the chases, but having them with almost every boss fight was a bit predictable, but I digress. After defeating Rhino, Spider-Man has a spider sense jump off, giving him a hint that Eddie might still be alive. Later on, Silver Sable and her team attack Venom, setting us up for many back and forth encounters between Venom and her attack team. As you can already tell, we jump back and forth between Spider-Man and Venom for each of their story events, but this game does a great job at making each event feel separate but connected at the same time. Like you play certain missions as Spider-Man and others as Venom, but they both interconnect and are shown within or mentioned in each of their missions to bring everything together. For a story game with multiple heroes, the devs balance this pretty well. We pick up with Peter during a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and while there he starts getting headaches that are triggered by Eddie, and the two fight it out on the roof of the building. Here's where we can see the impact that Eddie's presence has on Peter when he is in close proximity to him. After the fight, Venom tries to escape but is captured by Sable and taken to a prison set up by Boulevard Trask and Adrian Toomes. While imprisoned, the pair explain to Eddie that Trask knew his parents and that they needed him to test the suit for them, saying that no matter if he agrees or not, they'll get someone to test the suit. With Eddie agreeing to test the suit, this led us to the Electro boss fight, as he had just recently escaped prison. This Electro fight was fun, but also a pain. Not only were we trying to defeat him, Spider-Man shows up and gets knocked out trying to stop Electro as well. So this fight was us trying to stop Electro while protecting Spider-Man in the process. The plot did a great job at setting this up, as simply testing the Venom suit couldn't be as simple as going into a training room and fighting some basic enemies. Fighting a supervillain is the best way to test the suit, as it was only natural that Spider-Man would sense Electro's presence and try to save the day. Again, just another moment of all this world feeling connected and together. Nonetheless, Venom escapes, but to my surprise we go back to Silver Sable and tell her that Peter is Spider-Man. Soon after we escape, once again, we are chased by Sable's men. This sequence where you have to fight Sable's men in the city is probably the hardest fight in the game. I'll get to that later on though. Switching back to Peter, we see this flying villain who calls himself the Beetle, who frees Green Goblin, and then we chase throughout the city and then fight him. One thing I forgot to mention is that when chasing Beetle, he does manage to grab a vial that reads Sandman, leading us to assume that we'll see him later on. Unfortunately, that's not the case, as there is no reference or Easter egg to Sandman that occurs later on in the story. Maybe this was just a setup for a potential sequel, but most likely this is due to something that happened in the comics already, but since I'm not well versed in the comics, I'll just leave it at that. Beetle then chases Venom in an attempt to get a sample of the Venom suit, leading to a boss fight against Beetle, but with us playing as Venom. Venom defeats Beetle and we flee the scene. With Silver Sable believing that they cannot capture Venom, her and the team turn their attention towards Peter and shoot him up with tranquilizers, knocking him out until he wakes up on the Queensboro Bridge, leading to a fight between Peter and Silver Sable. This fight never reaches a conclusion as a car crashes trying to swerve out of the street and we have to save the civilians on the bridge. Once everyone is saved, Venom appears out of nowhere and knocks out Sable, leading to yet another chase sequence where we have to follow Venom and save Sable. After fighting Venom, we pass out, due to the amount of tranquilizers still in Peter's system, giving Sable an opportunity to take us back to Trask and Toomes. For a second there, I did wonder why Peter passed out, but when you think about how many times Sable shot him with those tranquilizers, it makes sense he fell unconscious. She must have shot him like 10 times. Any normal person would probably be dead. Back at Trask Industries, we see Eddie hear Peter scream and find out that Toombs injected him with their own sample of the Venom suit, turning him into Carnage. When Carnage awakens, Venom recognizes that it's Peter immediately, leading us to another boss fight. After defeating Carnage, we absorb the suit but spit Peter back out. To Eddie's surprise, absorbing the Carnage suit and the leftover Venom that was inside Peter gave Eddie full control of Venom.
Yes. Eddie? Eddie, what's going on?
I have absolute, total control.
One thing you might have missed, because the scene goes kinda fast, is that after absorbing Carnage, the white emblem finally appears on Venom, giving him the same look that we're used to. As the majority of the game, he doesn't have that white symbol. With this newfound control, Venom then hunts down Trask, seeking revenge for his experiment. Of course, Peter gets in the way and won't let Eddie kill him so Trask can be fully punished for his crimes. As we reach the rooftop, we run into Silver Sable, who mentions that her contract to Trask has expired and we don't have to worry about her anymore. This brings us to the final boss fight in the game, which was a huge pain, as Venom tries to push the helicopter that Trask was in off the rooftop as we play as Spider-Man, who tries to stop him. After defeating Venom, S.H.I.E.L.D. arrives and Peter reads the files that Trask had kept regarding the plane crash that had killed Peter's parents. A nice twist was Peter's parents died on the plane because Eddie Brock Sr., Eddie's dad, had tried the Venom suit while on board the plane. After this discovery, we see that Eddie survived the fight with Spider-Man. He then found Trask in prison, killing him because he wasn't satisfied with the measly 3 years prison time Trask had received after putting Eddie through all of that torture.
I have been looking forward to this.
Eddie? I can't believe.
You know what I can't believe? I can't believe that after all the things you did, all the things you made me do, that after all of that, all you got was 3 years in a golf course prison.
You can't do anything to me in here. The guards...
They aren't near well enough.
Finally, we see Peter and Mary Jane sitting where he tells her that Eddie survives and is still somewhere in New York City. This story was simple yet complex enough to keep you guessing where the plot was going. Being set in the Ultimate Universe, it made it easy for the inclusion of familiar characters who all played some role in the overall story. Based on how they ended the story and left some things open, I do believe that the devs planned for this game to get a sequel, but unfortunately, that never came to be. Now that we covered the story, let's move on to the gameplay. Right from the first mission, it was easy to tell that this game took direct inspiration from Spider-Man 2. To start off with, the web swinging was identical to that game, as when you would swing you could press square to boost and make your swing faster, while receiving speed upgrades throughout the game. One cool addition that wasn't in previous games was the ability to climb up your web, allowing you to gain height so you could reach tall buildings or stay in line with whoever you were chasing. Even with the speed boost of the web swinging was still a lot slower than Spider-Man 2, but with that slow speed, it gave you the ability to focus where you were steering your web, giving you a bit more accuracy with each turn. The combat is pretty bare bones, as there's not a lot of complexity to it at all. You can perform a couple of hits by pressing square, which turn into multi-hit combos thanks to upgrades you unlock later on in the story. Depending on where you're fighting, you can do a wall bounce attack where you bounce off the wall and attack your enemies. If you're in the air and try attacking, you will perform a downward movement right on top of the enemy. It was disappointing to see that there was no combat upgrades like in the movie games, as learning new moves really opened up the combat and gave you different approaches to every encounter. On the other hand, I enjoyed playing as Venom a lot more than I did Spider-Man. First off, his melee attack is strong, and if you're able to corner the enemy, you could quickly chip away at their health. While not performing melee attacks, you could press triangle and perform a series of tentacle whips that could hit your opponent from long distances. This attack was the most useful, as many of the bosses moved around a lot, so being able to attack from a distance was definitely helpful. By far the coolest mechanic Venom had was the ability to feed on humans to regain his health. Feeding on normal humans would give you a lot of health compared to normal enemies that would only supply you with a small amount. Knowing when to heal was crucial, as if you waited too long, Venom's health bar would drop so low that you wouldn't have time to complete the feed and you would die. The way Venom was handled in this game was damn near perfect, From his design to how he actually sounded, it all just came off so menacing that it made me actually feel scared for everyone that had to go against him. Having the ability to jump extremely high distances and cover tons of ground almost felt like it was ripped right out of the old Hulk games from PS2. Everything about Venom just gave off the vibe that he was a villain not to be messed with. If Insomniac can take this portrayal of Venom and then turn it up a notch in Spider-Man 2, they have the chance to give us the best playable version of Venom ever created. This mechanic of feeding to add more health is a great segue into one thing I absolutely did not like. Why was there not health pickups when playing as Spider-Man? Now, unless I missed something, each combat encounter gave you 0 health drops in the case your health got dangerously low. Even after completing phases, you didn't get extra health. Because of this, your best bet was to finish the section, and then if you died, hope that the checkpoint started you at the beginning of the phase. I have no idea why this wasn't included in the game, as in every Spider-Man game before this, there are health drops that spawn after defeating enemies or that are found throughout the level. This game was easy, but the lack of health drops made some segments a lot harder than they had to be. In order to unlock the main story missions, you had to complete certain objectives around the city. These varied from races to combat trials and random events. Again, ripped straight out of Spider-Man 2. After completing each story mission, you would have to complete one or more of those events to unlock the next one. Believe it or not, the actual events themselves were repetitive, but they didn't feel like a chore to get through. The events themselves are pretty quick and were a nice change of pace after completing the main story missions. Another mechanic that was interesting was the whole dodge system. In order to dodge enemy attacks, you could simply move out of the way or press X when your spider sense will go off to avoid the hit. I liked the idea of dodging using the spider sense, but the addition of a block button would have made things a bit easier. Adding the ability to dodge light attacks but not heavy attacks would have gave you the option of how to defend, especially if you were struggling with getting the timing of the enemy's attack patterns down. This isn't game breaking, but just a feature that wasn't there that I think would have helped a lot. The boss fights in this game were pretty fun and made you think about what moves to use that would work the best against them. Not every boss could be beaten by using the same attack over and over again, even with the limited moveset that you were given for both characters. The Electro fight was a pain with you having to protect Spider-Man, but made sense as Electro could refill his health with electricity from the surrounding buildings. When Electro turned blue, it looked just like the Electro from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a nice switch up to the normal yellow Electro that we always see. What taints these boss fights is how you have to chase them throughout the city after you first encounter them. Each chase sequence is pretty long too, so by the time you get to your third or fourth chase, you're kinda over them. Chase sequences aren't a bad thing, but when you abuse them and place them at the same time for every villain, the whole gameplay loop just gets boring, eliminating the thrill of the chase, which is the entire point. Before we move on, I gotta mention the final boss fight. I understand that Venom was stronger because he absorbed Carnage, but this fight was difficult for no reason. Venom uses the same attacks over and over again, but his defense is so high that it feels like a chore to get his health all the way down. To make things worse, he's mainly open when he's underneath the helicopter. So when you attack him, he then counterattacks and you have to jump up and back so you don't hit the propellers. And then, as Venom's health deteriorates, flames just appear from out of nowhere from behind you, giving you even less space to operate. It may seem like I don't like the boss fights, but really I think they could have been designed better so that you could use the environment to your advantage or not be held back by objects other than the enemy. When not doing the main story missions or completing events around the city, there were plenty of collectibles that were hidden across New York. By collecting landmark tokens, comic book pages, and more, you could unlock various secrets like character models, comic book covers, and costumes. There are a lot of these tokens, so if you want to collect them all, it's going to take you a while. Fortunately, you can input cheat codes if you don't want to collect every single item. Overall, this game was a blast to play and the comic style felt like a breath of fresh air compared to the previous Spider-Man titles. Unfortunately, many aspects of the game weren't fleshed out enough to make it better than its predecessors. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game an 8 out of 10. It seems like each Spider-Man game that I review was good, but not good enough to separate it from the others, all for different reasons. However, just like the others, I highly recommend giving this game a try, simply because of the ability to play as Venom.
This suit, where did it come from? I feel fast, I feel strong, I feel good.
After playing Spider-Man 2, which for years I had considered that to be my favorite Spider-Man game of all time, I moved on to the final game in the Raimi trilogy, Spider-Man 3. Not having played this game in many years, I didn't remember much, but was expecting it to be much worse than 2, but to my surprise, it was actually pretty good. Unlike Spider-Man 2, the third movie in the Spider-Man trilogy is known to be the worst, so the story for this game wasn't going to be much better. Similar to the other games, we make our way slowly through the events of the movie with a bunch of padding thrown in between to make the game longer. What helps with this story is the solid voice acting, as there are more voice actors that voice their movie characters than in the previous games. Tobey sounded the best he ever has, and you could tell by the dialogue that he put more effort into his lines, as the quips and jokes sounded more authentic than they did before.
I am so sick of you mouth-breathing knuckle draggers. You wouldn't know power if it kicked you in the ass, and you sure as hell wouldn't know what to do with it if you got it. But hey, you think you're tough guys? In that case, show me what you got.
Having J.K. Simmons actually voice J. Jonah Jameson made all the Daily Bugle scenes that much better, especially since you have to complete several photo missions to progress the game.
Luke Carlisle, you're the Mad Bomber, but you're one of the richest businessmen in the city.
It's worth noting that these story beats are not rendered cutscenes, as each scene is in-game and uses the same character models that you see in the normal gameplay. This wasn't the case in Spider-Man 2, as some of the important moments had those high-quality cutscenes, but in this game, I don't think it was necessary. With this title being on the PlayStation 3, the jump in graphics made a big difference, making everything in the game look better than anything we had seen before. For the most part, it does a good job at staying true to what happened in the film, as we see memorable moments like the Harry vs. Peter fight in the beginning, Black Suit Spider-Man vs. Sandman, and the suit being passed from Peter to Eddie. The biggest difference in the story in the game versus the movie is that somehow this game is darker. If you've seen the movie, then you know that the tone is already darker than the last movie, but this game takes it a step further. So in the movie, we know that Sandman is trying to get money so he can get the medicine he needs to save his daughter, but his family is poor, so he has to acquire the money by any means necessary. However, in the game, his daughter isn't even mentioned until we see Eddie confront Sandman, asking for help with killing Spider-Man. In this scene, Eddie blackmails Sandman by hanging his daughter from a tree and threatens to kill her if he doesn't help. A switch up from the movie, but one that makes his game darker than the film. Also, how they killed Venom after the final battle is just gruesome. Instead of him dying in the explosion, this happens instead. Overall, the story is missing some parts from the movie, but it included enough to make it worth at least one playthrough. The gameplay is where this game differs the most from the past Spider-Man games. First off, the web swinging is the same from Spider-Man 2, but for some reason the actual swing speed was slowed down. Even with the speed boost you get later on, it's not nearly as fast as it was before. There's so much more that was fleshed out in the last game that was very bare bones in this third installment. To progress the game, you have to complete missions that are located around the city that are represented by different colored circles. What each color represents, they don't tell you. What missions or requirements do you need to complete to unlock the next story mission? The game doesn't tell you. The game just has a big map with a bunch of stuff littered across it, and you're just supposed to figure it out. Playing through this had me confused because in the previous games, it told you exactly what you needed to do in order to move on to the next chapter or unlock the next story mission. If you've been playing games for years, then you could have guessed that all you need to do to finish the game is to complete every mission, regardless if they're story related or not. The best way to figure out what to do is by opening up your camera and looking at the mission tab to see what your objective is. This seemed to work, but I only use this during the actual missions, so it really depends on the player in regards to how helpful it really is. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the menus and layout of the game feels too bare bones. There isn't enough detail in the menus and other screens to help enhance the gameplay experience and help you find what you're looking for. In regards to the combat, this is one of the brighter areas of the game, as it lines up with the previous titles with you being able to perform a long list of combos by inputting a certain button combination. Like before, you can open the pause menu and find the combo list to perform the exact moves that you prefer to use in combat. The combat feels fast and it's easy to dodge attacks from enemies, as by pressing L1 you can slow down time, dodge the attack, and then press square to perform a counterattack. Knowing when to dodge was important because if you just spammed attacks, then the enemies would perform their own attacks and go right through your punches and kicks. After playing with both suits, the combat while wearing the black suit is so much better than the red one. When using the black suit, you can perform certain combos that you can't use when wearing the red. But the best aspect of using the suit is the rage mode, where you become enraged and gain a temporary boost in damage, which helps out in almost every combat scenario. If you perform a super attack while in rage mode, the damage that you cause is staggering in comparison to the damage you inflict while in the red suit. When you have to go back to the red suit towards the end of the game, I recognized the difference in combat immediately. What I liked about this game was how ambitious the mission structure was. From the beginning of the game, each mission felt different and introduced new mechanics that weren't present in the older games. As you traverse through each location, you would face these environmental set pieces that you could get through by completing QuickTime events that required you to press certain buttons to finish the scene. Since this game was on PS3 and 360, these moments were well done and gave the game a more cinematic feel, unlike anything we had seen prior. These QTE segments helped enhance the battles we already knew about, making them feel closer to the actual movie than they ever have before. The boss fights are a lot more exciting and have multiple phases that are split up by missions or small segments. What's great is that the boss fights feel like they lean into the best abilities of each villain. Like in the Kraven fight, in his second phase, he uses the powers from different animals that influence his attack moves for each part of the fight. This is just one example, but the boss fights feel separate from one another and help keep the gameplay fresh from the same loop of completing activities and random events that occur throughout the city. For the final boss fight, you have a segment where you play as Harry and have to destroy the Mega Sandman, but to control Harry you have to use the Z-axis on your controller to move Harry in the direction you want to go. I understand that at the time, putting motion through your controller was the latest gimmick, but it didn't fit this fight at all. I like the idea, but it would have been easier to just move him with the analog sticks. The missions outside the main story ones are divided up by different types of gangs, each leading back to Kingpin, which was a great fight. But one of these groups used tons of bombs that you had to disarm to save buildings from exploding. These puzzle minigames were harder than they looked, as it required you to press buttons at the right time, move electrical currents to the right area, and rapidly press multiple buttons to unlock inner pieces. This seems minute on the surface, but I thought this game did a great job at making it feel like you were really stopping a bomb from detonating, a small gameplay mechanic that helps differentiate it from all the other stuff. There are additional activities that you can do when you're not going through the main missions that included races, combat trials, and more. These are pretty similar to the last game and aren't required to unlock additional missions that will progress the story, but if you want a nice change up from doing nothing but missions, these are sure to keep you entertained. This gameplay does some things better than before, but there's too much that feels like it needed some more thought put into it. It makes no sense why there was aspects that were included in Spider-Man 2 that weren't present in this game. It gives off the impression that the devs intentionally left it out or watered the gameplay down instead of enhancing what was already there and making it better. Regardless, the gameplay is fun enough to keep you coming back to each mission. The graphics from the PS2 games to the PS3 help make this game look better than it ever has. With the updated graphics, the characters actually resemble their movie counterparts more than they did before. The models don't look the greatest, as most of them have these giant bug eyes that pop out of their face, but they're a huge improvement from the blurry models in the older titles. Even the NPCs that you see on the streets and in the cutscenes look more realistic, helping add to the immersion of the game. The buildings look better, but it's not as big of a jump. But inside each environment is where you can see the biggest difference. Whether you're in the sewers or in the city streets, each area looks better and pops off the screen, creating unique environments that align with specific villains or missions. Seeing the graphics make me wish that we got a Spider-Man 4, because the next game that would have came out could have been the best looking Spider-Man game out of all the Raimi films. Spider-Man 3 is a solid experience that could have been so much better. The game was fun, but there was too much that wasn't fleshed out like the previous game. Because of this, the game feels a bit rushed, like it needed another year of development, but because they wanted to drop this around the time frame of the movie, they rushed it out. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7.5. I would say give this game a try if you enjoyed the previous games, but be ready for a little bit of confusion and some frustrating gameplay sections.
Spider sense tingling? Weird. Usually only goes off if there's danger, but everything looks as calm as a...
Hello, Spider-Man. Come for the meteor shard? Well, you can't have it!
First Doc Ock, and now the Green Goblin? I have got to get a new travel agent.
After playing through the Spider-Man games based on the Sam Raimi movie trilogy, it was time to move on to something different. A game that wasn't based on a movie, but a fresh take on the Spider-Man character that would bring us one of the funnest Spider-Man games I have ever played. Spider-Man: Friend or Foe. The story for this game is very simplistic, which works perfectly for the type of game that it is. Long story short, the meteor that contained the Venom symbiote crashes down on Earth, breaking into multiple pieces, which manipulates the villains' minds, causing them to spiral out of control, and it's up to us to save the villains and save the world. The game does a great job of explaining this, as after the intro you get a lengthy mission briefing that thoroughly explains the entire situation, setting the stage for the rest of the game and making the main objective clear right from the start.
We've tracked the various pieces to their landing sites, but before we could move in to collect them, these nasty pieces of work started showing up.
Perpetual holographic avatar, nanotech offensive monster, or Phantom.
You guys have a department just for acronyms, don't you?
Phantoms aren't biological. They're a mix of solid light holographic technology and the symbiote substance found in the meteors.
So after the initial setup, there isn't much more that's explained in regards to the story. There are cutscenes in between that occur before and after the boss fights, but they don't add a whole lot to the story and are more in line with the dialogue segments between Spider-Man and the corresponding villain. As you get deep into the game, the mastermind behind all the chaos is revealed, serving as a nice surprise if you weren't listening to the dialogue as you completed each stage. After defeating the final boss, it's pretty easy to guess where the plot was going to go next, but it still wrapped up the story in a satisfying manner. Based off the ending we got for this game, it led me to believe that a sequel was on the table if the game performed well. But when you look at these review scores and critic reviews, it comes as no surprise that this game didn't get a proper follow-up. In the end, this story is simple and fun, which makes it a great game that you can turn your brain off and just play. And if you do pay attention to the story, the ending makes all the hard work of saving each villain worth it. The gameplay is where this game drastically differs from all the previous Spider-Man titles that had released before. Right off the bat, the character designs were still based off the Raimi trilogy, but featured a different take on the characters themselves. This gave many, including myself, the vibe that this game is a spiritual successor to Spider-Man 3 that we never got, even if the game isn't called Spider-Man 4. At its core, this game is nothing more than your typical beat-em-up fighter, with you fighting waves of enemies at different locations while you progress the story. The fighting itself strikes the perfect balance between fast and slow, allowing you to execute various combos, but the moves themselves aren't performed so fast that you never get hit. There is a small window after performing a combo that allows the enemy to counterattack if you're not paying attention, so it's necessary to always perform your attacks with the expectation that a counterattack may be on the way. Of course, the main gimmick of the game is the addition of the sidekicks. These sidekicks are unlocked as you finish each level, because at the end of many levels you either fight a villain or find a hero that needs help, which would then become your sidekick. There are plenty of these sidekicks to choose from, with each character having their own special moves that only they can perform. In addition, each character's base attacks are unique to them as well. For example, when playing as Venom, his basic attacks are heavy and slow since he is more of the brawler type of sidekick, while Blade's attacks are quick and snappy, with him using his sword to cut through enemies at a fast pace. The difference in combat between the sidekicks helped give you so many possibilities when it comes to approaching the combat situations. So once you find the sidekick that you love playing with the most, you can stick with them when going through the levels. A cool unlockable after finishing the story is that New Goblin becomes a playable sidekick that you can pair with Spider-Man and run through the levels with him. Now that you've got the sidekick that you want, the game goes more in depth at making your Spider-Man and sidekick unique to your playstyle. To explain, once you have your selected sidekick, you can increase various stats for them and Spider-Man by collecting these tech tokens, which are automatically given to you by defeating enemies during battle. Collecting enough tech tokens would allow you to upgrade a character's health, toughness, strength, and special abilities. Upgrading these would make your Spider-Man and sidekick stronger and more formidable as you progress to the harder stages. But for Spider-Man in particular, you have even more that you can upgrade. Spider-Man has 3 unique web abilities that only he can use during combat, and based on which you like the most, you can choose one to use and then upgrade the moves inside that specific web combat ability. For me, I prefer the web line ability because the throws in this game are overpowered. So when I spent my tech tokens, I chose to upgrade the throw abilities because I like to throw my enemies around constantly during the fights. So whichever web ability you choose, you can do so and upgrade the abilities that cater to how you like to fight all the enemies. But wait, it gets even better. This game leans a lot on destructible items within the environment, so while going through each stage, you're going to be doing a lot of smashing and throwing. Upon breaking these crates or chests, you receive various power-ups. These power-ups could be one of 4 things: health regeneration, mega damage, invincibility, and hero strikes. You could collect these within each level or use tech tokens to buy them from the inventory tab back on the helicarrier. Essentially, these power-ups make the game extremely easy to get through. Even if you never leveled up your characters, as long as you had enough power-ups, you could finish each stage. The game doesn't hold back on giving you enough of these either, as they're found in almost every chest, and outside of the hero strike, you can hold more than one of them at the same time. Out of all the 4 power-ups, the coolest one by far was the hero strike, which is a super attack that is custom to the sidekick that you're using. So if you're playing with Blade and use a hero strike, you will perform this attack. But if you use New Goblin's hero strike, you'll perform this attack instead. These hero strikes are visually appealing and inflict massive damage on whatever enemy it is, big or small. The fact that each strike is unique to the sidekick you're using shows the effort the devs went to when trying to make each pair of characters feel different than the other. It's worth mentioning that you can use these hero strikes during the boss fights because every boss fight you're playing by yourself as Spider-Man, and the hero strikes require 2 characters to perform. Inside each level, there are collectibles that you can find beyond what we've already discussed. Usually found in hidden locations are DNA helixes and keystones. DNA helixes would unlock different rewards that you can access on the helicarrier by clicking the rewards monitor. When looking at the monitor, you will find rewards for characters, locations, enemies, and movies. These rewards aren't anything special, they're pretty much just bios on each character along with some level designs. If there's one collectible I would say you can skip out on collecting, it would be these. The keystones were these stone-looking tablets that when found would unlock doors filled with enemies in a special arena. After clearing out the enemies, you then unlock that arena for use during versus mode. So if you found all the keystones at every level, then you would have plenty of arenas to use when playing with friends. A good way to increase the replayability of the game without making the player do anything tedious on their first playthrough. The boss fights are really fun, but maybe a little too simple for many fans. To start off, when encountering the bosses, you have a cutscene in the beginning which introduces you to the character. And then you have these little scenes in between after completing a certain phase of the fight.
Hold still so I can bop you one.
Each fight doesn't require you to perform special moves or do anything over the top, you just have to avoid simple obstacles or attacks and then hit the enemy to cause damage. How you hit the enemy isn't always a physical attack either. As in Venom's fight, you don't hit the symbiote, but rather hit the bells that cause damage to him instead. In the Green Goblin fight, you throw his pumpkin bombs right back at him, which cause damage since he never leaves his glider. Even with the simple mechanics to every fight, each boss is enjoyable to fight against and had unique movesets that align with their powers that they're known for. To put it simply, if you're a fan of beat-em-ups and like Spider-Man, this gameplay is going to check all the boxes. It's almost everything you could want in a beat-em-up game surrounding Spider-Man. I thought it was worth mentioning that the level design was great. Each stage felt different from the others, adding a sense of immersion to the game that I wasn't expecting. The devs even took it further and put the villains inside the stages that they would most likely be in according to their powers. A great example is how Sandman is found in the desert surrounded by nothing but sand, instead of being on one of the floors at Oscorp. The subtle platforming in each level made it feel like you really were traveling all throughout the stage. The design helped make each level flow and help reduce the repetitiveness of the gameplay loop. To my surprise, this game had a very kid-like tone to it and doesn't take itself as serious as the movie games. This was a nice change-up, as since this was a beat-em-up game, I think it made a lot of sense. Having a game like this be very serious would have held it back from appealing to children who were interested in Spider-Man. Because of the change in tone, I think this influenced the voice acting. It wasn't that the voice acting was bad, but the voices for some of the characters could have been better. Out of all the characters, the only voice that I just couldn't stand was Venom's.
I knew it was gonna be Venom, but I was really hoping it wasn't Venom. Have we ever figured out why you need so many teeth?
The better to eat you with.
It shocked me to see that Quentin Flynn, the voice actor for Axel in Kingdom Hearts, voiced Venom in this game because his voice playing Axel is great, but for Venom, it just didn't hit. I would say brace yourself when it comes to hearing these characters, because after playing through the movie games where most of the main cast was the same, this switch up in voices can be a bit jarring at first. Not a huge deal, just something worth mentioning. Overall, Spider-Man Friend or Foe is a game that completely caught me by surprise. On the surface, it looks like a game that you wouldn't even try if you saw the trailer, but once you get into the combat, the game is very addicting and it's just pure fun. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game an 8.5. After playing through this game, I think it's massively underrated, and if it were to be remade today, then this game would sell like hotcakes, especially with the popularity of Spider-Man at an all-time high. Spider-Man Web of Shadows is the first true single-player experience after the Spider-Man movie games, and considering that this title was made by Shaba Games, I was a bit skeptical upon returning to this game after not playing it for so many years, but the little doubt that I had was quickly erased only moments in, as right from the start, the game sets the tone for what the rest of the game will be like. The story for Web of Shadows is different than any Spider-Man game we had gotten before. To start off with, the city is already in chaos, and when the game begins, we have already gone through a lot of the events that led up to that moment. Before we even get a chance to grasp what's going on, we see Eddie inside Venom and Mary Jane still being a damsel in distress, and then flash back all the way to the beginning before any of this had even started. Taking the approach where you play the game through one flashback was a risk, but I think it paid off. Since you play the majority of the story through just the one flashback, it felt natural and not forced. Unlike some games that try to tell the story through constant flashbacks that ruin the immersion and never allow you to get situated, this story flows well and it's easy to see how the city deteriorates from where it was at the start. The main gimmick that makes this story different than the normal storytelling is the ability to make choices that align with either the red suit, which is good, and the symbiote suit, which is bad. Each choice comes within the same situation, with different things happening depending on what you decided to choose. What's great about these choices is that they're never hard to make, like whatever you decide to do is because you want to be good or because you want to be bad. It's not like Telltale games or Dark Picture games where the actual choices themselves are hard to make because you don't know what's going to happen or because people could die. In this game, if you make a choice, the only consequences are how you're viewed by the public and the other heroes that you meet over the course of the game. Because of this, it entices the player to make the choices based on the suit that they prefer to play with. For my playthrough, I chose nothing but the symbiote suit choices. Why, you may ask? Simply because you get the romance Black Cat. I don't know about y'all, but when choosing between Black Cat and MJ, I'm going with Black Cat every time. MJ is literally useless, but I digress. As you progress through the game, the story evolves in a certain direction regardless of the choices you make. The tone starts off more on the positive side, but as Venom causes more chaos, the whole situation just gets worse and worse, giving off this doom and gloom type of vibe for the rest of the game. The story isn't really progressed through the missions themselves, it's more like you complete a bunch of missions and eventually one of them will move the story forward. This isn't a bad thing, but if you were expecting the typical mission, cutscene sequence, then you may be disappointed. Once you get deep into the story, you may find yourself wondering how long this flashback sequence is, because as I mentioned before, the majority of the story takes place in the flashback. By the time you finish, there's only a couple hours of the game left. The timing of when to return to real time couldn't have been placed in a better spot, because as soon as you feel like the game is beginning to drag, you snap back to the moment from the opening and pick up with those events. By the end of the story, you face the consequences of your choices from each mission, with the ending being a reflection of the path that you decided to follow. Overall, this story exceeded my expectations and felt like the devs wanted to make a zombie type game, but with Spider-Man. Having symbiotes take over the city in place of zombies and place Spider-Man right in the middle of all the chaos is genius. If you're looking for a unique Spider-Man story, then this game definitely delivers. Before we get to the gameplay, I had to shed some light on this voice acting. The voice acting in the game was top notch as each character sounded great, but even more, I thought that the characters sounded like what they actually should sound like. For example, Mike Vaughn, who voices Spider-Man, sounded like the nerdiest Spider-Man ever, as every line he gave just sounded like Peter was a total geek underneath the suit.
MJ, it's me. How are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm helping
Good.
Luke run a
That's
store at
good.
the shelter.
Hey, listen, I have a crazy idea that might save us. I'm going to Rikers prison to get a mad scientist to make a bomb to destroy the Sim things without hurting any of the people. I know the Tinkerer's in there.
Uh-huh.
Of course, I'm gonna have to break him out of prison because S.H.I.E.L.D. and the police are after me, but...
Uh-huh.
Mary Jane? I'll be breaking the law.
Okay. Look, you have to do what you think is right.
Thanks. Gotta go. Okay, time to do something drastic.
Other voice actors like Trisha Helfer, Robert Wisdom, Steve Blum, and others all made the characters come to life in the way they needed to. The voice acting helped convey the emotion that they felt with everything that was going on within the city. The gameplay is similar to what we've seen in the movie games with some new additions that make the whole experience different than the previous entries. Just like the older games, we're able to swing all around New York City, going from rooftop to rooftop, climbing up walls, and running around the streets. The swing speed is slow in the beginning, with you being able to upgrade that by collecting these small spiders located on rooftops all over the city. Once you collect enough of these, you'll be able to move up a level, increasing your health and swing speed, which is useful towards the later half of the game. One thing that was done really well was the traversal, especially while on or alongside buildings. Web zipping from place to place is very easy to do and doesn't feel like a chore, with you always moving forward but in the direction you want simply by pressing a button. Then when you want to climb up a building, you have multiple options. You can crawl up, run up, or web zip up every structure, all being useful in certain situations depending on the mission. What this game did better than any Spider-Man game before it was the gameplay while you're on the side of the buildings. When going up buildings, you're going to run into enemies, both on the building or flying around it. What's great is while crawling or running, you can approach the enemy and attack them while standing on the side of the building. You can perform attacks without falling off too, as once you finish performing a combo, Spider-Man will just remain stuck to the wall, making it easy to repeat combos while waves of enemies continue to attack you from all angles. The combat system takes what was laid out in the earlier games and builds upon it, giving you even more control over your specific Spider-Man. First off, you have the ability to switch in between the red and black suit at will, allowing you to pull off suit-specific combos whenever you want. When attacking the enemies, you can press attack multiple times to pull off normal attacks in both the air or the ground, with you being able to change combos by delaying your inputs for a certain number of seconds. If you press the triangle or Y button, you can shoot webs or use grabs, which sets you up for even more combos. You can upgrade all of your attacks by accessing the Upgrades tab in the menu. Here you can upgrade your ground, air, wall, super attacks, and your web shot or tendril attack depending on the suit. What's cool about the upgrades is that you can choose which combos within the category that you want to upgrade. So if you wanted to perform a certain ground attack combo but not one of the others, you can unlock just that combo but leave the others for the remainder of your playthrough. Doing this for both suits will help you craft the ultimate Spider-Man, one that will play exactly the way you want it to. It's worth noting that even if you only use one suit, it's worth upgrading both suits because there are situations late in the game where it's not beneficial to wear one suit versus the other, so if you neglected one suit the whole playthrough, you might be in for a bit of trouble. Similar to Spider-Man Friend or Foe, this game had the addition of sidekicks that would help you in battle. The choices you made determined which allies you would be able to fight alongside during each fight. You meet a nice handful of heroes and villains during the story, with many of them being sidekicks that can help you later on. But if you choose to be evil, but you want a hero like Luke Cage to be your ally, you're out of luck, since in order to have him as a partner, you have to choose the good path. Another great example of how your choices matter, and that there are consequences to going down whatever path you decide to follow. Since I chose the Dark Suit path, the allies I could choose from was Black Cat, Vulture, Rhino, and Electro. Each ally had their own attack moves and served as valuable companions that actually helped destroy enemies instead of just getting in the way. You could access the allies by looking at the HUD and scrolling left or right to pick which ally you wanted, and then holding down the directional arrow to call them in. Once called in, they would remain for the duration of the red bar that is under their character icon. After the red bar runs out, they will disappear until the bar is refilled. If you're in the middle of a fight and want to recall your ally, you can press the up arrow and they'll disappear, with your bar remaining at the point it was at the moment of recall. The allies help make it feel like you're not the only hero or villain in New York, making everything feel connected. The mission structure is similar to other games, but this time, instead of going to the main menu and looking to see what you needed to do next, you would return to certain characters where they would give you the task that you needed to complete. When choosing which task to do, the main mission is always the first mission on top, followed by optional missions underneath and dialogue segments at the very bottom. After completing a mission, you would just keep going to whatever character gave you the mission and keep completing them until you unlocked a cutscene, where you would then go to a new location after watching the cutscene. This formula may get old to some, but since they rotate the characters you take missions from, it is a good job at staying fresh. What does seem like it drags is some of the missions themselves. Some missions are really exciting with you fighting iconic villains or heroes in their symbiote form, while others are simple protect or escort missions. Especially once the city starts falling apart, the missions tend to be a bit repetitive, and there were times I found myself wondering when I was going to do something that would actually move the plot forward. If the missions were a bit more dynamic in terms of structure, that might have made them feel less like a slog while in between the major story moments. Outside of the missions, you can complete side activities that are littered across the map. These could be killing symbiotes to rescuing citizens to stopping normal criminals, but they are all reminiscent of similar activities in the past games. Each activity is represented by small circles that are found within your area on the map, and when a crime is happening, a message on the screen will appear letting you know that something's going on. Compared to Spider-Man 3, this game did a better job at distinguishing what objective was what, making it easy to know where to go and what to do. Having the HUD in-game and in the pause menu be more detailed and thorough helped eliminate unnecessary frustration and confusion, making the entire gameplay loop flow even better. There are plenty of different enemies that you fight during the game, but outside of the soldiers, they all have one thing in common: they're symbiotes. So based off that fact, you would think that you would be fighting the same symbiotes over and over again, but that wasn't the case. You fight different symbiotes, all with various abilities and difficulties that make them unique from the others. For example, there's a type of creature that appears as a mix of symbiote and Electro. These creatures are very annoying as you can climb poles and fire electric shots at you, interrupting your combos until you stop what you're doing and go after and destroy them. Having symbiotes take on the personality of their hosts was a great idea and made the enemies more memorable than they normally would be, but the devs took it a step further and had boss fights surrounding the villains who were consumed by the symbiote, having you fight symbiotic versions of that character. This was cool to see as the characters looked completely different than they did before, but had some unique identifier that let you know that they were different than the other symbiotes you were fighting. Speaking of boss fights, they were very fun and included some additional flair with the inclusion of QTEs that gave them some spice once you got towards the end of the fight. Unlike Spider-Man 3, these QTEs were developed better and weren't overly used, so you never knew when they were going to pop up. The timing on them was forgiving as well, as if you were a little late with lining the button up within the circle, you had a second or two to recover and you could still execute the movement. The boss fights made you pay attention to the boss's attack patterns and figure out which suit worked the best to get you through the fight. In the end, Spider-Man Web of Shadows is a great game that is the perfect blend of old and new, creating an experience that feels fresh and rewarding. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 9. If you have not played Web of Shadows, I would highly recommend it, as the ability to switch between both suits whenever you want, plus the unique story, makes this game stand out from the rest. If you're a Spider-Man fan, you're sure to have a great time playing this title.
The tablet of order and chaos. Selling you on the black market is gonna make me a mint.
Good, you can use a mint. I can smell your breath from here.
Spider-Man?
Wait, how would you eat a mint through that fishbowl?
Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions is the first true multiverse Spider-Man game that we received, and I was a bit concerned about how the gameplay would be considering you play as 4 different Spider-Men but it actually turned out pretty well. The story for this title is very simple and easy to understand. Pretty much, Mysterio breaks into a museum and breaks a magical tablet which has its pieces scattered across dimensions, and it's up to the Spider-Man in each dimension to recover every piece in their world. The simplicity of the story reminds you of Spider-Man Friend or Foe, as once you know you have to go through each dimension and obtain each fragment, you just rinse and repeat the same loop over and over until you get to the final boss. Once you get a fragment, you don't hold on to it until you collect them all. You always return to Madam Web, who then adds that piece to the others until you return with more. Madam Web being your guide throughout the story was a nice change up from the normal narrators and mission objective screens that were present in the older games. She didn't tell you exactly what to do, but she pushes you in the right direction so you don't get stuck in the same area for too long. As you probably already know, you play as Amazing Spider-Man, Ultimate Spider-Man, Noir Spider-Man, and Spider-Man 2099, with each hero having multiple fragments in their specific dimension. Because the fragments are scattered, it's not as simple as going to each dimension and looking around giant areas until you find the piece. In each dimension, one of the fragments is found by a villain who you must defeat in order to obtain the piece. To make matters worse, they actually use the fragment to their advantage, creating the worst possible scenario in regards to actually obtaining the piece. The story makes it clear from the beginning that each piece of the tablet gives its users enhanced powers, making them stronger and faster than they were before, thus making them harder to defeat. With the villains using this to their advantage, they cause untold destruction across a plethora of areas to make things very difficult for that dimension's Spider-Man. Because getting to the final fight is such a chore, receiving each piece of the stone felt rewarding and made it feel like you really earned it. What's great is that having a story that is built up by collecting one thing after the next makes it easy to get excited for the culmination of everything once each piece is collected. Personally, I think the ending is right what it should be. After collecting all the pieces, it puts the story to bed without it being too complicated. Overall, this story is easy to understand and does a great job at dividing up the plot between all four Spider-Man. Because you switch between each of them for each level, none of them overstay their welcome. Except for maybe Noir. He kinda sucks, but I'll get to that soon. For a first attempt at a multiversal game, I think Beanox did a solid job at the story. The meat and potatoes of the game revolves around the gameplay. As I mentioned earlier, the gameplay loop is similar to older titles, with you switching Spider-Man as you move from level to level, but let's take a minute to discuss the levels themselves. First off, each level started off with the villain right in the beginning, so you knew exactly what you were going to face when going through the level. The levels themselves were similar, but varied based on the Spider-Man that you were playing as. All four Spider-Man had levels based on their own dimensions, with them facing dimension-specific versions of iconic villains we've seen before. Many times, these levels consisted of large open spaces that required you to complete some sort of objective to move forward. This could be defeating all the enemies, smashing televisions, disabling generators, or something else entirely. Regardless, you always had to do something simple in order to unlock the next area or cutscene within the mission. What was cool was how the enemies were designed around what villain was in that level. In the last mission for Ultimate Spider-Man, the villain in that world is Carnage, and because of its abilities, it affected the soldiers, causing them to mutate. So in moving around the level, the small enemies you would constantly encounter were these mutated soldiers. This is just one example, but when you go through the other levels and face these unique enemies, it helps add to the overall world and make everything just flow seamlessly. The traversing in this game is surprisingly good, as you don't walk in a straight line from area to area, but instead you're web zipping up and down buildings and surfaces, all while chasing the villain. What's even better is that the environments always change as you move on to the next level, so even though you're returning to the same world, you're never in the same area more than once. The web swinging wasn't the best as it felt slow and stiff, but it works well enough to get you from place to place. Same thing goes for the wall crawling, as it takes a second to attach to the walls, and when you do attach, you don't crawl up them very fast. To be honest, as a whole, the movement in this game is very static and could have used a tune-up as it just felt a lot slower than it did in the past games. A unique mechanic new to this title was the first-person camera shots. As you face these villains, many times the camera will cut from third person to first person and then prompt you to start attacking your enemy. This is a nice change from the typical QuickTime events that have been present for years and makes it feel like you're the one beating that villain to a pulp. But of course, the villains can attack you too, so you can't just punch away, as you have to pay attention and look out for the prompts so you can be sure to dodge on time or else you'll take some damage. These first person camera shots also appear when you're collecting the fragments. just adding to the overall satisfaction as it makes it seem like you're holding the piece in your own hand instead of just looking through the screen. The villains themselves were all unique and given a design that was well needed. Because these villains were in different dimensions, they aligned with the overall world of that dimension, making them even more different than their counterparts. For example, just look at Vulture and Hobgoblin. If you compare their designs to what they look like in the comics, they are completely different and look how you would think they would based on the world they reside in. Vulture is a lot creepier and menacing than normal and leans into the horror aspect, as he seems like a creature you would find inside a haunted house instead of the flying bird we're accustomed to. While Hobgoblin looks like a goblin that received some tech upgrades, making him faster and more deadly than ever before. Having him inside the Spider-Man 2099 dimension made perfect sense, as he presented a decent challenge and helped elevate the gameplay a lot. Unfortunately, the Noir Spider-Man sections needed a lot more time in the oven. In each of these levels, all you do is stealth attack a whole bunch of enemies and grab civilians while trying to stay out of the light. On the surface, this doesn't seem annoying, but doing this for multiple levels gets old real fast. To make matters worse, if you do get spotted, trying to fight the enemies is a lost cause. Attacking them after being revealed just ends with you performing a bunch of combos, with the enemies blocking each one until you get frustrated and then retreat back to the darkness. Because you're forced into this repetitive gameplay loop, these Noir sections just become a pain and make you want to get through them fast so you can play with the other heroes. This is a shame because Noir is a cool variant, but his sections are so poor that they stand out as the worst part in the game by far. When it comes to the actual combat, it's toned down some from past games, but still has enough there to give you some flexibility during the gameplay. For each Spider-Man, there are combat upgrades that you can unlock that give certain abilities to each hero depending on the situation. To unlock the combat upgrades, you have to complete in-game challenges that would unlock these spider points that served as the currency for unlocking the upgrades. The more challenges you completed, the more currency you would have. You could check what challenges you completed or not completed in each level by going to the Web of Destiny, where it had all the challenges laid out in each level. What's nice is that you don't have to unlock the same skill for each Spider-Man, as you can pick and choose which hero you want to have which ability, instead of them all having the same skills no matter what. You could take it a step further and choose not to upgrade the combat moves for a Spider-Man at all, and make them completely bare bones in terms of combat moves, making the game even harder. After purchasing these moves, you would be able to perform different combos by pressing different combinations of square and triangle, creating new abilities that would cause decent damage to enemies. These abilities weren't anything over the top, but they were enough to help in diversifying the combat. Speaking of spicing up the combat, Ultimate Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2099 had special abilities unique to them and only them. Ultimate Spider-Man had a mode called Rage Mode, where you would gain enhanced strength for a period of time, making it easy to wipe out gangs of enemies in no time at all. This whole Rage Mode made a lot of sense, since, you're in the symbiote suit. When playing as Spider-Man 2099, you had the ability to slow down time, allowing you to move behind enemies and dash through long areas. In my opinion, this was by far the best power, as slowing down time made everything so much easier, especially when surrounded by large groups of enemies. These moves weren't overpowered either, as there are bars underneath your health bars that serve as meters that would run out when using the ability and fill up after defeating the enemies. The boss fights are designed a bit differently than past games, as you fight many of the bosses more than once, fighting them both before and after they gain a hold of a fragment. These fights aren't too hard, but they do require you to pay attention, because they often demand you to perform some sort of move to lower their guard and leave them open for attack. Like in the Vulture fight, you have to lure Vulture up to the areas that have spotlights, and then once it's in line with the light, flip it up to stun him and inflict some damage. Instances like these are a nice addition to the gameplay because they force you to think a bit instead of just attacking away, and don't require QTEs to perform each guard breaking move. Now, it wouldn't be a Spider-Man game if there wasn't additional secrets that you can unlock after completing the story. In the game menu, there are various tabs that you can pick from, with extras varying from alternate costumes, concept art, figurines, and movies. If there was a reason to replay levels, it would be to run through some of them while wearing the alternate suits. Not only are there more suits, each Spider-Man has additional suits that are variants of their original suits, making it even more enticing to throw them on and fight through some levels. In the end, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions took a lot from previous Spider-Man games and meshed it all together to make a unique, multiversal Spider-Man experience that is worth at least one playthrough. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game an 8. If the noir sections were developed better and the movement was more fluid, this game could have been so much better. Regardless, if you're a Spider-Man fan, then you should give this game a shot, purely because you can play as Spider-Man 2099 before you add in everything else.
He's been siphoning Alchemax's resources into converting the Gateway and the old virtual unreality lab into something else. Something dangerous. I've tried talking to him, but he's got no time for Miguel O'Hara. But people make time for Spider-Man. Just use the convenient access to the ventilation system to get inside, and then Walker and I can have a little chat.
Spider-Man: Edge of Time cuts down the number of Spider-Man from 4 to 2, reducing the number of playable characters but raising the stakes in a way I didn't see coming. The next entry after Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions sees Amazing Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2099 tackle a unique dimensional challenge, one that would push each of them to their absolute limits. The story for this game is more serious and darker in tone, doing a great job at making the player feel the gravity of the situation. Without spoiling, you jump back and forth between Spider-Man 2099 and Amazing Spider-Man as someone disrupts each of their dimensions with the goal of rewriting history so they could change fate. What makes the story so good is that you're thrust right into the action from the start. There isn't a lot of padding and build-up that sets the stage for what's going to happen, but instead you start a new game, get a short recap of the situation, and then it's go time. Eliminating the usual plot setup and just jumping headfirst into it was a nice switch up from the normal intro that would just drag for 30 minutes until you finally find out what's going on. Now you would think that bouncing back and forth between each Spider-Man would get annoying, but the story balances that well by having what happens in one dimension affect what happens in the other. So there's many times that I would be playing as Spider-Man 2099 and found myself deeply invested into what was going on because I knew that the choices I made in this dimension would affect the Peter Parker in the other dimension. Having the dimensions linked this way enticed me to care about each Spider-Man's dimension equally, instead of just rushing through one hero's mission so I could get to the other. This story has a layer of realism to it that helps push it forward so the player never wonders where we're actually going. You know that the whole point of the story is to save both dimensions so we can ensure the world's safe, but while trying to do that, things happen along the way that just make everything more difficult. These events make sense and add more chaos to an already chaotic situation, keeping the intensity high so the game never starts to feel stale. Unlike Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, there is no Madam Web to guide you on your quest, so you have to rely on the other Spider-Men to help guide you from section to section. This helped add to the world and make it seem like nobody else could really help you, like there were no other superheroes anywhere else on the planet and it was just the two Spider-Men. By the end of the story, you're left feeling like you went to hell and back to get the outcome that happens. Every single switch you had to pull, door you had to open, or enemy you had to defeat all led up to that moment. With the high stakes and dire consequences, this story is one that takes itself seriously and helps create a unique Spider-Man experience. The gameplay is where the game could have used a little bit more work. It's not bad by any means, as the combat is still enjoyable because you're doing what you've always done, which is swinging and fighting enemies, but what this game doesn't do is reinvent the gameplay to make it stand out from the games before it. On the surface, it's obvious that this game is a new title and not DLC, but when you actually play the game, it's not crazy to think that this game is pretty much Shattered Dimensions DLC. Starting with the traversal, it's just like any other Spider-Man game where you swing from place to place, web zip across gaps, and climb up walls. Nothing has been changed about the movement to give it that additional flair or pop that would differentiate it from before. On top of that, the web swinging still feels slow like Shattered Dimensions. This isn't a huge knock, but it still baffles me that after so many Spider-Man games, the speed of the web swinging is gradually slowed down after 2 instead of getting faster or improving. It's like the devs for these games wanted to focus more on controlling where you swing instead of the speed of the swing itself. Now, since most of the game takes place in different areas inside one place, there isn't a whole lot of room to be swinging anyways, but it would have been nice to swing fast on those occasions where we needed to swing. Custom to Spider-Man 2099, there are segments where you dash through these long vertical spaces. This was present in Shattered Dimensions, so when these portions came up I wasn't surprised, but for this game they changed something that alters the gameplay completely. As you're dashing, instead of moving Spider-Man to avoid some of the obstacles, you have to move a cursor to where you want him to be instead. I don't know why they thought this would be a good idea, but it's a huge adjustment to be aiming a reticle instead of aiming Spider-Man. Now there's other games where you have to move through areas while avoiding obstacles, And to my memory, most of those games required you to move the character you were controlling, not a cursor or a reticle. Changing this up may make you dread these sections instead of enjoying what's supposed to be an epic moment. The combat is pretty basic and doesn't do a whole bunch to improve what was established in Shattered Dimensions. You could perform your normal combos by pressing a combination of light and heavy attacks that you could use whenever, and in addition, each Spider-Man has the ability to slow down time, allowing them to get behind opponents and dash through lasers that were protecting important machinery. You didn't have unlimited time to use the ability either, as there's a meter that runs out after a bit of time. The meter is represented by the emblem that's right next to the health bar in the left corner of the screen. Now underneath that health bar is another meter. That meter is for your special ability for each Spider-Man. For example, Spider-Man 2099 has the ability called Accelerated Decoy, which will create an additional version of yourself and redirect enemy fire to that decoy while you ran around and attack the enemies. This ability was triggered by pressing L2 and would end after the meter would run out. These special abilities prove useful when facing enemies that had a fast attack pattern or were very aggressive. Since you're playing as two Spider-Man, there are upgrades that you can unlock for each. These upgrades can be for both Spider-Man or be character specific, with one Spider-Man having a certain ability that the other doesn't. In order to access these upgrades, you have to collect blue portal energy and gold spiders. The blue portal energy are just blue specks that are located all over each area and are very easy to find and collect. These give you the currency needed to purchase the abilities to go to both Spider-Man. On the other hand, the golden spiders from the last game make a return and are much harder to find this time around. Instead of being in plain sight, you have to find hidden rooms and look on walls and ceilings to find these spiders. These spiders are what you need to unlock abilities for one Spider-Man individually. Because these are harder to find, you have to choose your upgrades wisely and make sure you don't waste them. If you don't go out of your way to find these gold spiders, you could play through the whole game with little upgrades outside of what's automatically unlocked. One great addition was how the objective could be found by just pressing the pause menu. Since you're swinging around large spaces, it's easy to forget what you need to do inside each area. By pausing the game, you can see exactly what needs to be done and how to do it, keeping you on track without having to click a couple tabs to find all the mission objectives that needed completed. The lack of a mission objective screen isn't surprising since there isn't any side quests in the game. You could collect other things when going through each area, but outside of that, the whole point is to accomplish what we needed to in order to push the story forward. Personally, I didn't mind not having side quests, but having some small objectives outside of the challenges could have been a nice change of pace. If you haven't caught on by now, this game is very linear. There aren't many boss fights in the game, but when they appear, they're about what you would expect for a fight. Nothing over the top, more aligned with a one-on-one fight that is just you two using your basic attacks to see who'll win. Unlike the older games which relied on QTEs to finish the fights, this game took a more classic approach and had you beat the enemy by getting their health all the way down to zero. If there was anything to take out from the boss fights, it's that they lacked the spectacle and awe that was present in some of the older games. Now I did mention that QTEs weren't a focal point in the boss fights, but they were still used during the normal gameplay. When opening doors and activating switches, you would have to press or tap a button in order for Spider-Man to perform a movement. I didn't mind this since many of the doors you had to open were locked in some capacity, so using QTEs in these areas made a lot of sense. It's worth noting that the button prompts were a lot smaller than they usually are, so small that if you don't pay attention, you may not even see them. When going from room to room, there are some collectibles that you can unlock by completing challenges and defeating enemies. Once again, these are similar to the last game as they can be figurines, newspapers, archives, and more. I'd be lying if I said I actually wanted to collect these, and in my opinion, there is no real reason to collect any of this stuff, other than finding out some lore and background information surrounding that specific dimension. When it came to the collectibles, I may have taken a quick glance at when picking up the item, but after that, I never went back to the menu and took a deeper look at what I got. Overall, Spider-Man Edge of Time is a game that did little to move the needle. Even with a gripping story, the gameplay feels so similar to the last game, it makes me wonder why this game didn't just release as DLC for Shattered Dimensions. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7. I would say if you enjoyed Shattered Dimensions, then you should enjoy Edge of Time, but if you were to skip this game, then you wouldn't be missing out on too much. I feel like if this game got a remake in today's graphics, then it would be so much better than what we have right now. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a game that had the opportunity to improve on what the Amazing Spider-Man 1 had achieved and make it better. Unfortunately, this game did the exact opposite of that, making for one of the worst Spider-Man games I've ever played. So on the surface, it's obvious that this game is a video game adaptation of the movie since they are titled the same and both released during the spring of 2014. Based off the obvious information, you would think that it would be similar to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movie games, where during the main story you play through the events of the movie. But believe it or not, this was not the case at all. I'll avoid spoilers on the off chance that you actually want to play this game, but you start this game playing as Peter and relive Uncle Ben's death again and use that as a motivation to find his killer. Once it starts, it's clear that this is not an adaptation of the movie, yet a standalone story with some movie beats thrown in. It's like the writers had a certain story they wanted to tell and just said, hey, let's just make sure we have this fight, that fight, and this scene in here, and then they can't say we didn't include aspects from the movie. To make matters worse, for the small moments that were included from the movie, they weren't fleshed out enough and just seemed to be thrown in there with little effort or planning. Now if you're watching this video, then I'm going to assume that you watched The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and know how that movie ends. In this game, the ending is completely different than what happens in the movie, as in the movie you fight Goblin and fail to save Gwen as she falls to her death in the clock tower. However, in this game, the final fight isn't even against Goblin, it's against someone else entirely. And if you thought that it couldn't get any worse, Gwen isn't even in the game. She was present right from the start of the first game, and then for some reason, she's just not in this one. For a game adaptation to not have a character from the movie that is extremely important to the story is insane. I could see if she was a side character, or one that could be removed from the plot and make sense, but her death in the movie is the climax of the entire film, and without that moment, the whole tone of the film is completely different. Other than Spider-Man, the other characters in the game weren't memorable at all, except for Black Cat. It seems like every one of these Spider-Man games, the one thing Menace gets right is the model for Black Cat, as she always looks great with every new iteration. Nonetheless, this story does the absolute bare minimum to recreate the pivotal moments that were present during the film. With it missing so much plot, I see no reason why to play through the story more than just one time. The gameplay is similar to the last game and does little to improve upon what the mechanics that the Amazing Spider-Man 1 had initially implemented. Just like before, you have access to an open world New York City, with most of the game taking place in Manhattan. For some reason that I don't understand, the camera is extremely close to Spider-Man as you swing all throughout the city. Keeping the camera close helps push the camera issue front and center. When you swing to each building, there are times where it's hard to angle the camera where you need it to be so you can look at what you want to look at, because it's locked right on top of you, so it's hard to see everything in sight. The web zipping is changed from previous games, as you still press a button to zip from place to place, but what makes this annoying is that there's a slight delay after pressing the button. The whole concept of web zipping is that you're supposed to go from rooftop to rooftop seamlessly with little effort. If you try to traverse across the city just using web zips, you will go fast, but the delay between each ending location makes it annoying because it feels like the game is lagging. Unsure if the devs wanted this to feel more cinematic, but the final result didn't reflect that decision. If there was a small bright spot, it was the web swinging. The web swinging is faster than some of the older games, and the addition of being able to swing from each hand was welcomed, as normally you would just press one button and swing, regardless of where you were in the city. Because of this, you have to pay attention to your location, as if there are no buildings nearby, you won't be able to swing at all. This is realistic, as it makes sense that you can't swing unless you're near an object to swing to. But it's not perfect, as there's a mechanic in place that allows you to gain height while swinging, but doing this, you just shoot webs directly up in the sky, completely contradicting my previous statements about the swinging. Just like everything else, the web swinging is flawed and could have been better. The actual combat is very bare bones and doesn't offer much to make it different than what we've gotten before. As expected, you can press one button to perform all of your attacks and then another button to dodge. Upgrades do exist in this game, but they're not used for the actual combat moves. The upgrades you receive are for abilities that you can use instead. For example, if you earn enough points, you can upgrade an ability called Seismic Blast, which allows you to unleash sonic waves that will push back your enemies. Now, why they didn't have the long combo list where you could unlock more devastating combos makes no sense, and it hindered the combat, making it a lot more repetitive than it needed to be. Like other story-driven games, you played through story missions that pushed the game forward and helped you inch closer towards the conclusion. As I mentioned with the story earlier, these missions aren't from memorable moments from the movie. Additionally, these missions lack creativity, as most of them are just go to a place, hide from the bad guys, beat down the bad guys, and then rescue the civilians. This game is pretty short, as there's only 14 main story missions, so you can get through them all pretty fast. Upon starting a new game, you can choose from 3 difficulties: human, hero, and superhero. The scaling in difficulties is not great, as playing on human you do tons of damage to enemies while you receive very little, which is expected, but on superhero everything is more difficult, but not in the good way. Instead of having to use skill to defeat the enemies, what you're supposed to do in order to defeat the enemies is more difficult. Like for those sections where you have to sneak around and not get spotted by enemies, the enemies hear you and see you a lot faster, but even when you get out of sight, the attention gauge remains filled. Honestly, it doesn't matter what difficulty you play this game on, just beating the game one time is an accomplishment. When not doing story missions, you can partake in side activities that are scattered around the city that included beating up thugs in alleyways, stopping car chases, and saving people from burning buildings. These activities were here purely to affect your reputation in the public. A gimmick that was present was the reputation meter, which would increase or decrease based on your actions throughout the city. So if you were to perform heroic acts like rescuing civilians, this meter would increase towards hero, meaning that the city views you more as a hero, while on the other hand, if you ignore these activities, it would move towards menace, showing that the city views you more as a villain. Now at first glance, this appears to be a cool mechanic, similar to Web of Shadows where you had the choice to be good or be evil and embrace the symbiote. Where it falls short in this game is how you can spend all the time increasing the meter so it's all the way filled up towards hero, only for the game to take you through a mission, and then upon exiting that mission, your reputation meter is all the way towards left, pushing it towards menace. Doing this takes away all the incentive for completing the side activities in the first place. If you know that every time you complete a mission, your meter could be negatively impacted, then what's the point of grinding and completing side activities to increase the meter to begin with? Now you could say, hey, you're exaggerating a bit, it's just a meter, who cares? Well, there's dire consequences for having the meter filled towards menace, as turrets are mounted on rooftops across the city, and electronic barriers are placed everywhere that would disable your web shooters when ran into. Having to deal with this while going through the normal missions in the city is a huge pain and hampers the gameplay experience. So what's the alternative? Just grind out the side activities until your meter is back in hero status. I hope you see the problem with this reputation system, but let's move on. There are a few boss fights in the game, and the main 2 that you would expect to see, which is Green Goblin and Electro, they're present, but they're very lackluster, failing to create any sort of spectacle that you would expect for the 2 main villains from the movie. When going into the boss fights, I would say to keep your expectations low, because these are nothing more than glorified one-on-one battles which require little skill to actually win. One final note about the gameplay is the loading screens. I understand that it's last gen and loading screens weren't super fast, but this game felt like it was poorly optimized. Like every time we entered a new place, we were met with a long loading screen. It didn't matter if you entered the comic shop, started a mission, or hopped on the train ride home, you were met with a loading screen. Not a huge issue, but one you may find annoying on your playthrough. When it comes to the graphics, this game does look better than some of the older titles, with it releasing just last gen on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Unfortunately, there are many environmental bugs that are too obvious to miss while in gameplay and during the cutscenes. Many times when you're in a dialogue segment with a character, something on them or around them will shimmer, move, or just fall out of place. Just look at this scene with Harry. If you notice, his drink went from being a cup to stretching across his entire chest. Bugs like this shouldn't be present and just gives credence to the fact that this game was rushed out to be in line with the movie. It's a shame that the graphics weren't taken more seriously, because there are some moments where the graphics do look nice, only for that to be ruined by a visual bug. In line with the older games, this game offers a lot in regards to extra unlockables. There are a variety of suits that you can use during a single playthrough, with each having abilities that would make combat easier depending on the situation. In the middle of the city, there's a comic book shop run by no other than Stan Lee, which houses comic book covers, figurines, and posters, which are unlocked by completing minigames inside the arcade machine in the back of the shop. These minigames aren't anything over the top, but had you complete certain challenges like defeating waves of enemies to unlock the posters. The posters are concept art for characters and the environment for the game, and serve as something nice to look at for a couple seconds. Overall, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a poor attempt at a game adaptation of the movie and doesn't do much to improve on what was present in the older Spider-Man titles. In my opinion, it's clear that this game was rushed and pushed out for release so it could coincide with the film. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 5. If you still have a copy of this game via physical or digital and have some time on your hands, then give this game a try. But if you don't have this game, I don't recommend buying this game at all. This is easily one of the worst, if not the worst, Spider-Man game I have ever played. After the Amazing Spider-Man 2 that released in 2014, we went a solid 4 years without any Spider-Man titles. Many Spidey fans like myself were just itching for another Spider-Man game that would do the character justice, for a Spider-Man experience like no other. Fast forward 4 years later and we have Spider-Man 2018. Made by Insomniac. As soon as they released the first gameplay trailer, I knew we might have an instant classic on our hands. But now, 6 years later in 2024, and after the release of its sequel Spider-Man 2, does this game still hold up? Let's discuss. When it comes to Spider-Man games, gameplay is king. If the gameplay is trash, then the entire game is most likely trash too. So going into this, Insomniac had to nail this component of the game, and it's safe to say, they hit it out the park. The most obvious area which was improved from before was the web swinging. Right from the opening scene, when you start swinging from Peter's apartment, you start to grasp how good the swinging actually is. Even though you're only using one button to perform the swing, I thought it still felt natural and very free-flowing. Like every swing was one smooth movement instead of it being forced or janky. I thought it was a nice touch for you to be able to perform tricks while in the air, as it gave the game a small touch of reality in the web swinging department. Like if Spider-Man was actually real, of course he would be doing tricks mid-air. It made complete sense. Honestly, words can't describe how good it feels to swing across a city. If you haven't played this game, then you just don't know how it is. Even if you played the older Spider-Man games, they don't compare versus this 2018 game. However, if you were to say that the Sam Raimi Spider-Man 2 game still has better web swinging, I would understand, because that swinging is almost perfect and it's a lot faster than this game's swinging. Other than that game, the swinging in 2018 is miles better than anything we received prior. But even more, it's not just the swinging, but the overall traversal made it feel like you really were moving as Spider-Man. When not swinging, you could web zip onto walls and certain points on top of buildings that would allow you to pinpoint the exact spot where you wanted to be. Once you get a hold of the timing of the transition between web swinging and web zipping, you can move across the city at a pretty nice pace. Of course, this speed is nowhere near as fast as Marvel's Spider-Man 2, but back in 2018, this was good enough. Speaking of speed, that is where you may notice the biggest difference between this game and all the other releases. In almost every category, this gameplay is the fastest it's ever been, as of 2018. And since you're constantly running, jumping, and crawling all over the place, I'm glad this was the case. There's nothing worse than needing to perform actions quickly and you just can't because of how the game was built. Nonetheless, the combat is where this was the most noticeable. As you could expect, you fight so many enemies, some being one-on-one, but a lot of times it's in large groups with multiple waves. Just punching and kicking anything felt really fluid and fast. Like you could feel how different you were compared to the normal enemies. It's like you were moving at a different speed, which you kinda were. Even when completely surrounded, you were never at a disadvantage. What I thought this game did a good job of was the enemy variety. Most of the time in Spider-Man games you're fighting henchmen, so Insomniac could have copied and pasted the same enemy for every single encounter. Instead, they kept them similar but tweaked them a bit to align with the specific villain they were associated with. For example, when you first start the game, you fight Kingpin and all of his men wear orange jumpsuits. So a lot of times when fighting them at other stages in the game, you know that it's Kingpin's men because of their outfits. Small details like this make a big difference when you have a lot of combat encounters. Take it a step further and these enemies do more than just your normal physical attacks. Some have guns, melee weapons, or are just super big, but all pose a unique challenge that you have to adjust for. I love how the game mixed all of these enemies together because it forced you to constantly have your eyes all over the screen to account for everyone. If I had to say what enemy I hated the most, it's definitely these Power Ranger type of enemies. They have these automatic laser guns and take a decent amount of hits before going down. So when you're surrounded by these guys, you might be in for a long fight. Now you might be thinking, okay, you've been talking about the combat, but how does it actually work? Well, that's a great question. To my surprise, it's actually semi-in-depth and you can create some really cool combos if you remember how to use everything at your disposal. Of course, you have your punches and kicks that you can perform with just the press of a button, but where the fighting really opens up is when you start using the gadgets. These gadgets give you so many options in regards to how you approach every combat scenario. It doesn't matter if you're fighting grunts or a boss, once you know what each gadget does, who it works on, and when it's best to use it, it makes this game a cakewalk. In my opinion, the gadgets are OP, but too much fun not to use. Between the impact web, spider drone, and suspension matrix, I was just running through every enemy. But if I had to narrow it down to one single gadget that was the best of them all, I would give it to the suspension matrix. When used, this gadget would make all enemies in a certain area levitate in midair for a certain amount of time. This doesn't seem like anything crazy, but when you've got 10 enemies all huddled up together, throw one of these things and you'll be able to punch away for a solid 5 to 10 seconds before the effect wears off. As I mentioned before, the beauty in this combat is when using gadgets in tandem with the fighting. For example, you may be fighting an enemy and your punches push him into a corner. Instead of just doing another combo, you can end your attack with an impact web and stick him right onto the wall, getting rid of another enemy really fast. Multiply that sort of execution in regards to every person you come across, and the encounters are never a challenge. However, as good as the combat is, it's not perfect. Many times when you're trying to dodge enemy attacks, you can press the dodge button on time, which is when your spidey sense goes off, and you may still get hit. Most of the instances where this happened to me was due to a rocket or gunshot, but it was still kind of annoying. Another issue is the detection system when going through stealth sections. Similar to the Batman Arkham games, you have these segments where you have to take out enemies while remaining as quiet as possible. In order to do this, you need to take out the thugs without being seen. This isn't hard as there's an indicator over every enemy that tells you if you should get that bad guy or not. But sometimes, even when it says safe, someone in the area will be alerted to your presence even though they were nowhere near where you were. This didn't happen all the time, but when it did, it was just another slight annoyance. Another area that I think could have been improved were some of the boss fights. None of these fights were bad, but they were just missing something. I can't pinpoint exactly what it is, but the best way to describe it is like the way the enemy fights mimics a normal thug that you would find on the street, but their physical appearance is that of a supervillain. Now sure, not every fight was like this, but there was times where I found myself thinking, dang, that was it? That was kind of a weak fight. Even still, they're all enjoyable. I just think there needed to be a larger gap in terms of the difference between supervillain fights and everyday criminal fights. This brings me to what is my biggest gripe of the game: the 4 stealth sections. When not playing as Spider-Man, you play as Mary Jane and Miles Morales in these stealth segments that require you to find something and take out enemies in the process. My problem with these isn't the fact that they're not fun, but it's the amount of times that you have to do them. You have to do like 2 or 3 with each character, and they're introduced during the worst times. I don't mind playing as the other characters, but anything more than one segment of this was just too much. Insomniac would have been better off having a flashback explain what that person did, instead of having us crouch around for 20 to 30 minutes just to reach the same cutscene anyways. Believe it or not, using Mary Jane in these sections was actually better than Miles. Both of them are able to create distractions by using the environment to their advantage, but what I think makes MJ's sections a bit better is that she gets a stun gun that she can eventually use on the enemies. So if you memorize the enemy's movements, you can just use the stun gun and knock out everyone, making her sections a lot easier. If the amount of these segments were reduced, then this might not be as mundane and repetitive as I thought they were. Speaking of repetition, this game is very repetitive outside of the main story. When not doing the main missions, you have a plethora of activities you can participate in, all which are optional, but reward you with XP nonetheless. These include grabbing backpacks, fighting enemies at hideouts, taking pictures of iconic New York monuments, and other things. These activities sort of fill out the game to give you a bunch of things to do when not doing the main story. If you're a massive Spider-Man fan like myself, you won't mind doing all of this, but if you're just a casual fan, you're not going to want to do every single thing. Sure, they all have slight differences, but it's all relatively the same. Like the backpacks are not located in the same spots or positions, the enemies are not the same at every hideout, and the monuments are not all located in the same area. Regardless, you're still performing the same actions over and over and over. It really can get old quick. Now there's side missions that provide you with some small story context, but they're nothing you have to go through. Just some smaller missions to help occupy your time. But my biggest issue isn't with the activities themselves, it's the fact that they're forced on you when going through the main story. To explain, there's times when you have to go through multiple story missions just for the game to be like, hey, we can't have you going through this too fast, go do some side stuff. And it will tell you to go upgrade your gear, find collectibles, etc. It's okay if you want to upgrade your stuff, but if you're one of those people that don't feel like upgrading anything, then being forced to do so is definitely a con. I'm not sure if these are on a timer or if you just have to complete a certain number of them until a main mission unlocks, but having entire dedicated segments just for this is a little much. One of the most important pieces of side content are the unlockable suits. Insomniac did a fantastic job with adding a bunch of suits that you can choose from and play with during any session. All of them look great, and some of them even have bonus abilities that will help you during combat. Which one you like to use is completely up to you, but what's great is that you're not forced into any one suit, outside from the beginning when you have no suits available. Personally, the main suits that I used were the Raimi suit, the Homecoming suit, and the Far From Home suit. I thought those 3 looked really good. What's crazy is that if you're a diehard Spider-Man fan like myself, then you know that there's additional suits that weren't even included. Even still, there's a lot to choose from, so many that you probably won't ever get bored of wearing different suits because they're all pretty unique. Now I did mention suit abilities. These are actually a lot more useful than they might seem. The main suit ability that I used was the resupply ability, which would refill the gadgets after they ran out. This was extremely helpful during the combat because if you're like myself and like to spam the same gadget over and over, This allowed you to do so. In the past games, you've had access to other suits, but it's never been done on this level. And the fact that Insomniac made them all free or unlockable just by playing the game is even better, especially in a time where companies charge for almost everything not included in the base game. The side content aligns with the previous Spider-Man games, and it may seem like it's just padding, but if you played the older titles, then you shouldn't be surprised by any of this. Spider-Man games have always had a bunch of repetitive side stuff to help fill out the game, but even with everything that I just mentioned, I think it could have been a lot worse. The story for Marvel's Spider-Man is a lot better than I thought it'd be. Of course you play as Spider-Man, but there's plenty of moments that involve Peter and the different things he goes through. What I liked the most was the interactions between Peter and all the different characters. It wasn't just him and MJ in every scene, but instead a constant rotation of mixing and matching different people depending on where the plot was headed. Another thing I appreciated was that we didn't start out with high school Peter Parker, but a Peter that is more grown up and experienced, meaning that we can get right into the good stuff. No need to go through the introduction of his powers and all the stuff that we've seen in the movies countless times. This game kinda starts off with the notion that you've seen at least one Spider-Man movie or know of his origin story, eliminating the need to regurgitate all of that information for yet another time. I thought the pacing in this plot was also pretty good, as a lot of things were happening but the ups and downs were never too drastic. When it was a climactic moment, you knew, but when things slowed down in the story, it made sense. However, if anything was interrupted, it was those stealth sections I mentioned earlier. Either way, I thought everything flowed well and it set up a lot of story for the next installment. The biggest difference I noticed between this story and the other games is that this story is really emotional. For a game set in its own universe and having to introduce us to a new set of characters, it did a great job at having us feel connected to each one of them. From Miles to Aunt May to Dr. Octavius, you gain a deeper understanding for the character and why they act the way they do. Even more, you sympathize with their motives and see why they take the actions that they take. At first, you may not think you'll care much for these characters, but if you're already a Spider-Man fan, seeing how these characters are depicted will help you latch onto everyone once you get far enough in the game. Avoiding spoilers, but comparing this to the sequel, when I initially reviewed that game I said the story is better than this title, but after returning to this, I think I like this story a bit more. Both are good stories in their own right, but in my opinion 2018 just hits home a little more. Like the stuff that you go through is more emotional and will hit you right in the feels. So if you shed a small tear by the end, I don't blame you, because by the time everything is wrapped up, you truly feel the weight of what it means to be Spider-Man. Nonetheless, the story for Spider-Man does a great job at laying the foundation for a brand new universe, while staying true to what the superhero is at its core. Sure, some of the villains could have been fleshed out a bit more and we could have spent more time with them, but considering how many villains Spider-Man has, I guess it's okay that not everyone gets a whole bunch of screen time. But if you were worried that this is just another run-of-the-mill Spider-Man story, trust me, it's not, and it's definitely worth your time. This brings me to the DLC that consisted of 3 side stories that continued the events after the main missions were finished. Each of these are relatively short in length, with it only taking me a couple hours to complete them all. If I'm being blunt, these are exactly what you might expect. Each story surrounds a certain character, with Black Cat being the first, Hammerhead being the second, and Silver Sable being the third. All the stories are interconnected, but the characters I just mentioned are featured more heavily in their respective DLC. Going through the main story missions were actually pretty good though. Nothing too over the top, but enough to keep you entertained. I liked how everything you do in these missions made sense and harkened to the character that the plot was focused on. More importantly, the story did a solid job at setting up where some people would be when Spider-Man 2 comes around. Now outside the main stuff, that's where it felt very samey. In each DLC there are new things introduced like the Black Cat paintings, Hammerhead compounds, and Sable compounds, but since you played the base game you're probably not going to want to do any of that stuff. It's just more of the same type of mundane side stuff that you can definitely skip. Of course there's some story and rewards behind completing these, but it just fills out the DLC like the same activities did for the base game. It's cool that Insomniac added this stuff because it does offer some replayability, but by the time you play this DLC, you may be too burnt out from completing everything in the base game to even care. It's worth noting that I really liked how we went to some new places and fought in different environments we hadn't seen before in these DLCs. You weren't going to the same areas you had already been and fighting thugs in the street over and over. There were some cool set pieces and the return of mechanics from the main story that made these additional scenarios better than you would expect. Even though it's not a big deal, you would be amazed at what changing the environment can do in a game when you're constantly fighting. It really does help make things a bit more lively and exciting. Outside the main missions, this DLC is just as repetitive as the main game, but it's still worth purchasing, especially since the majority of the time the Game of the Year edition is on sale with Spider-Man 2018, so you're not going to pay too much extra. Overall, Spider-Man 2018 is a great game with only a couple minor flaws. If we were back in 2018, I would argue that this is the best Spider-Man game ever, as it took everything that was done in the older games and made it 100 times better. All the stuff that was first established years ago, like the web swinging, side activities, and leveling up system, was done well and made the experience that much better. Combine that with an emotional story and addicting gameplay, and it's hard to put this down. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 9. I loved this game from start to finish and enjoyed my entire time going through this, even after 6 years. This game is always on sale and can be played via PlayStation Plus and PC, so there's no reason to skip out on playing this, unless you're strictly an Xbox player. Regardless, I highly recommend this game as it's an instant classic, and if you're a Spider-Man fan, this game is definitely for you. After finishing Marvel's Spider-Man 2018, I was prepared to be waiting for at least another 4 years for the next Spider-Man title. But to my surprise, in 2020 we got another Spider-Man game, Miles Morales. When it was first revealed, I was a little skeptical about how much content would be included since the last game was only 2 years prior. Nevertheless, once I got my hands on the game and started playing as Miles, it was clear that this is more than just a glorified DLC. At its core, the gameplay mirrors Spider-Man 2018, but it's been tweaked some to make it different than before. Of course, you're still beating up and throwing around all sorts of bad guys, but this time you have a couple new options at your disposal. To nobody's surprise, you're able to utilize Miles' bioelectric powers and channel them into a couple of different moves. These vary based on the button combinations you press, but all of them serve a purpose. By holding L1 and then pressing one of the action buttons, you're able to do something called a Venom move. Ironically enough, these don't resemble anything from the Venom we see in Spider-Man 2. They're just called Venom powers, which was a weird name choice. Anyways, the easiest to perform is the punch or throw by pressing L1 in either square or triangle. These didn't require much Venom charge and worked against almost any enemy. One thing I liked about the punch in particular is how you can aim it at one enemy, but when you execute the move, your punch may hit multiple enemies depending on how close they're huddled together. The throw is useful for trying to get someone out the way, but it's the move that I use the least. This leaves the other two moves, which are a top-down slam and a sort of ultimate attack. In my opinion, these moves are OP, as you can clear out a bunch of enemies in just one blast. I couldn't tell you the amount of times I was surrounded by both big and small types of henchmen, only to use a slam and knock all of them down. The Mega Charge attack uses up all your Venom charges and has you release a giant static shock across a huge chunk of the area. Obviously this is the best attack, but since it uses up so many of the charges, you would think you weren't going to be able to use it much. However, for me it was actually the opposite. Just like in 2018, you have a skill tree where you can purchase upgrades. One of the final upgrades you can acquire lets you release one of the Mega Blasts right when you're about to be dealt a critical blow, assuming you have enough charges. And since the charges refill pretty fast, it's actually really hard to die, because you can use these blasts over and over. These Venom attacks makes Miles truly stand on his own in comparison to Peter. Even playing on Ultimate, this game really isn't much of a challenge, similar to 2018, and much of that is thanks to the Venom attacks. If you played Spider-Man 2018, then you can imagine how this game is structured. It's literally set up exactly the same, but the side activities are different than before. Obviously. When not going through the main missions, you can do combat challenges, find underground caches, collect postcards, and some other stuff. If you didn't like the side content from before, then you probably won't like it in this. However, if you enjoyed the extra activities, then you're going to have a blast with these, because these are just as fun, if not more, than last time. One thing I've always appreciated with these games is how the activities have some story elements. A lot of times the side activities in games are just a bunch of filler that's literally meant to pad the game and lack anything important. But that's never the case with Insomniac's Spider-Man games, as they always have a little bit of story or background info that make them worth playing through. When it comes to the missions, it's exactly as you would expect. A good balance of action with enough slow moments to help you gain a deeper understanding of each character. There's plenty of fighting, but I thought that this title had more emphasis on puzzle solving than before. Many times you have to link things together with electricity or move things in place in order to progress. Of course there were puzzles before, but a lot of those were inside skippable side content. Although this time around I liked how it was introduced as part of each mission, making the entire structure flow naturally and not feel forced. Too many times we've played games where puzzles pop up at the worst times, or there's too many of them in general, but that was never the case with Miles Morales. These missions were just right in regards to balance, as there was enough fighting mixed in with puzzle solving to keep the pacing at a good level. What surprised me was the depth of the side missions. These were longer than you might expect and provide some semi-substantial content. They're nothing over the top, as they're side missions so you shouldn't expect them to be, but even still, they did a good job at keeping me occupied in between the story moments. Unfortunately, the game does force you to complete some side stuff before being able to progress to the next story bit. I guess in hindsight it makes sense because the devs don't want you flying through the game, but thankfully you only have to do one of these activities before you're able to progress. I'm not sure if this is the case for everyone across the board, but for me, every time I hit one of these moments, I only had to complete one of them. So technically it did get a little bit better. Earlier I mentioned upgrades, and I liked how these are all the same, but different. Since Miles leans into the technology a little bit more, you have visor upgrades along with suit upgrades that add another layer to the combat. These are similar to before as they add additional benefits like more ammo for your gadgets, resistance against certain weapons, etc. Getting these is easy as you can earn them just by doing all the activities that I mentioned before. All of these are helpful, but which ones you choose alter your specific version of Miles enough to make a meaningful difference in the actual gameplay. These upgrades never get old, honestly. Speaking of gadgets, this is the one area that I thought lacked compared to 2018. First off, you don't have as many of them, and that limits all the possibilities when it comes to combat. They all are effective, but for some reason they don't hit the same. If there was one that I would say is the best overall, it would be the gravity well. Throw it in the middle of a group of enemies and they'll all be forced into each other, knocking entire groups down. A close second would be the proximity mines, as the electricity that they give off is clutch during the stealth segments. Place it onto one of the plates located around certain rooms and you can take down multiple enemies with just one mine. These gadgets are still fun to use, but since there isn't as many, you might not gravitate towards them like you did before. Just a second ago I mentioned the stealth combat, and that's almost exactly the same, because you're still Spider-Man. What I thought was cool this time around was how you could use the gadgets to take out enemies without getting spotted. Just like the mines, you can use the environment to your advantage and place stuff down to take enemies out quietly. Take it a step further, and Miles' ability to camouflage makes it really hard to get spotted. The camouflage bar feels faster than the venom charges and makes the stealth areas a breeze. Even if you're terrible at Spider-Man games, you could use the camo and run through a lot of the combat encounters. It really is that clutch. In case you were wondering, you can use the camo to sort of re-hide even if you were detected. Camouflage is such a great addition to the game, and it's just another mechanic that makes Miles stand on his own compared to Peter. I wasn't expecting much in this area, but I thought Miles' suits could have been a bit better. Of course he doesn't have as much as Peter, but after trying out all his suits, there was just something off about him. The main ones I used were the Bodega Cat suit, the Into the Spider-Verse suit, and his suit from the start of the game. It could be because he doesn't have a lot of cool suits in the comics, but Peter's suits are 1,000 times better than Miles. Even still, I appreciated the fact that Insomniac gave us enough of them to pick from so we're not stuck wearing the same ones over and over. The gameplay for Miles Morales is similar to 2018, but has enough elements to set it apart from before. The activities included align with what you would expect out of a Spider-Man game, but have been tailored specifically for Miles. To put it simply, if you like 2018's gameplay, you'll like this just as much, if not more. The story for Miles Morales is better than I was expecting. For a game with such a small cast of characters, it's easy to discern the differences between them, and none of them feel like copies of each other. What surprised me is how the writers were able to introduce new characters and flesh them out enough in such a short time span. The thing that makes this more impressive is that there isn't a slew of villains to use either, making it a necessity to make each character at least semi-memorable. Pacing wise, I thought this game did a solid job at keeping things moving while slowly telling the story. Even if you know the characters from the comics, you might not be able to predict where the plot leads by the end of the game. The inclusion of familiar characters alongside the introduction of new ones really helped to create a universe that feels interconnected. When initially starting the story and finding out that Peter really wouldn't be in it, you might be a little skeptical. And honestly, I wouldn't blame you, because after the last game I was unsure if playing an entire game as Miles would work, but it actually did. Over the course of this short story, you see Miles grow up so much and truly understand what it means to be Spider-Man. It felt as if this game was the natural progression of the character that you would come to expect, considering he just got his powers at the end of the last game. Even still, what Miles goes through feels somewhat realistic as the problems he faces all scale in importance. From saving the city to restoring power to the apartment, everything he does fits perfectly. The main flaw with this story is simply the length. It's definitely not rushed, but another couple hours would have been nice to slow the game down some. Right from the intro with Peter, the game just flies. You start the first mission, and then before you know it, you're hit with the no point of return screen. Because of this, I suggest you take in each scene for what it is. If this story was just a bit longer, whether it be important plot points or not, then I think it could have been even better. Unfortunately, the villain isn't really the best. I won't say who it is, but compared to Peter's villains, this person just doesn't compare. I don't mean that they're bad, but if you're like me, you're probably not going to find them interesting. Like seeing who that person is and how they operate versus all the abilities Miles has, it's like, what are we doing, bro? cause they don't stand a chance. Yeah, this villain is in the comics, but from my understanding, this depiction of them isn't like that. I could be wrong, but either way, this villain was lacking to say the least. Nonetheless, the story for Miles Morales is short, but engaging enough to hold your interest. The introduction of new characters meshed with returning characters helped make New York feel connected. If you were worried about the story not being as good as 2018, in my opinion it's not, but this is still worth going through simply for the fact that it's a Spider-Man story where you don't play as Peter. Overall, Spider-Man Miles Morales is a good game with little flaws. The story isn't as good as its predecessor, but for a sort of side game that isn't a full-fledged sequel, this is as good as it gets. The gameplay is tweaked a little bit to make it unique from before, but still has all the elements that made the original game as good as it was. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game an 8.5. Miles is a great Spider-Man, and it was nice to go through a story that was custom to him. I'd say if his villains were better and the story was a little longer, then this game could have been really good. Regardless, I highly recommend this, and if you're a Spider-Man fan, you'll be sure to enjoy this.
I'm working on a college application, and it says I gotta tell them about myself.
More like sell yourself. It's the worst.
You got any advice?
Well, take me. Hi, I'm Peter Parker. I'm 25 years old, I have a bachelor's degree in biophysics, and I'm in love with the greatest woman ever.
After playing Spider-Man 2018, everyone including myself couldn't wait for the next installment, especially once it was confirmed that Venom would be in the game. Considering 2018 was Insomniac's first try at a Spider-Man game, I had a feeling that their second crack at a Spider-Man title will be light years ahead of the first, and it's safe to say I was right. I'll avoid story spoilers in case you haven't played the game yourself, only discussing what has been officially released in trailers and marketing. So the story picks up after Miles Morales, with both Spider-Man fighting crime together in New York City. Miles is trying to write his college entrance letter while Peter struggles to find a job being a teacher in the city. Right from the start, the game brings the issues that are going on with each character up front and center. For Miles, what happened to his father still haunts him, and he struggles accepting that he'll never have the opportunity to confront Martin Lee for killing him. On the other hand, Peter appears to be happy and content with his life, but when things get tough, his true emotions are revealed. The tone of this game is a lot more serious than the first. Not saying the first wasn't serious, but this one just takes it up a level. You can see the impact that the events have on each character and how they react to those moments end up shaping the rest of the story. Since you know that Venom is in the game, you could probably imagine how the symbiote affects not only Peter, but the others around him. If you're a Spider-Man fan, then you know that the symbiote affects the host's emotions, changing their mood and making them extremely aggressive. The story did a great job at understanding why the characters feel the way they do after getting in contact with the symbiote. There is so much emotion displayed by everyone, and the symbiote only heightens their feelings, making it clear why they're acting the way they do. But the trailers weren't lying when they made it seem like Kraven is the main villain in the game, because he is. Everything that happens story-wise is driven by Kraven. In other words, he's the catalyst behind each and every story moment. If Kraven doesn't take the actions that he does, this story doesn't happen. Kraven did a great job at pushing our characters into uncomfortable situations where they're pushed to the brink, causing them to damage the relationships they thought were stable. Once you understand everybody's motivations, you see why they act the way they do. Even still, this story felt like a bit of reality mixed with opportunity. Some things that happen make total sense, and once you start to see it unfold, you may find yourself guessing what happens next. But what you may not see coming are the opportunities that present themselves due to the character choices. As I mentioned before, emotion drives everyone into making their own decisions, but because of this, new and dangerous situations arise as a result. Even though the story is great, it's not perfect. The pacing is solid, but I think it could have been even better. After the beginning, which is very fast-paced and action-packed, the game slows down a bit and then ramps up to insane levels by the end. If there was a bit better pacing after that initial opening, then everything would have flowed perfectly. I've seen some reviews and people say that the pacing is terrible, and that's just not the case. If there was a perfect way to sum up the pacing, it's that there's so much action-packed stuff at the end that it could have been spread out to earlier parts of the game. Even still, the pacing should not ruin your experience at all. If there's one thing I desperately wanted from the story, it was that I wished it was a bit longer. Now I know that superhero games normally aren't very long, but with a game this good, I needed a bit more. The way the game ramps up and goes completely off the charts after a certain point makes it almost impossible to put the controller down. I was able to complete the main story in about 15 to 16 hours, and that was with me grinding like 13 levels by doing side quests and crimes. I don't think the game needed something ridiculous like another 20 plus hours, but another 3 to 5 story missions would have gave it enough padding to make the game length perfect. There are plenty of twists and turns that you definitely aren't going to see coming. What makes these so great is when they happen. You go into the cutscene and you see what's going on, thinking you know what's coming next, when all of a sudden you're thrust into a situation you didn't expect. This level of uncertainty was unexpected and helped me stay on my toes every time a cutscene was playing. The combination of voice acting, emotion, and consequences make this story better than anything we have ever received. Having played through every Spider-Man game since the PlayStation 1, we have yet to have an original story be as good as this. It's not too complex, but not too simple either. It doesn't matter if you're a Spider-Man fanatic or just a casual fan, everyone can understand this plot and have a great time. If you're nervous that the story for this game falls short, don't be. This is just about everything that a Spider-Man fan will want to see while still remaining true to what Spider-Man is and what he represents. The story delivers on all fronts and puts us in a great place for a third game, whenever that releases. What shocked me the most about this game was not the story, but the gameplay. If you played both 2018 and Miles Morales, then you know exactly how the gameplay works. So going into this game, I expected very little in terms of changes, and I was right. There isn't that many changes at all. But what they did change completely enhanced the gameplay and made it so much better than the last two games. By far, the most impressive aspect was the movement. Of course, the web swinging was already good from before, but somehow Insomniac tweaked it just enough to make it feel even better. If that wasn't enough, the addition of the web wings takes the traversal to new heights. The web wings can be activated by pressing triangle in mid-air, allowing you to glide across the entire city. When flying, you can tilt yourself up to gain height or down to get closer to the ground. A nice addition are these colored rings that boost your speed when you fly through them, allowing you to continue gliding while using the wings. These are especially helpful when flying across burrows and having to cross the large bodies of water. The fluidity that's present when switching between each method of transportation is what makes the movement so smooth. There isn't any stutter or lag when opening the wings after you just swung through the street, and vice versa. Being able to choose which you want to use makes you not want to fast travel across the city at all. Combine these mechanics with the ability to web zip across the rooftops and you'll be moving at light speed. Even if you mess up when flying or swinging, the wall crawling and wall running is still just as fast as before, keeping you moving at your desired pace. This upgrade in the movement proves useful during all the missions and makes catching anyone or anything easy, since you can move almost effortlessly from place to place. Regarding the combat, again, somehow Insomniac made it even more fun than it already was. The combat has more depth than it did before, but it's also more difficult as well. As usual, you can punch and kick your enemies, delivering some basic combos, but it's not until you unlock the additional skills that the combat truly begins to open up. There's a skill tree in the menu that has skills for Peter, Miles, and skills that can be used by both of them. Once you unlock these, you can perform notable moves like web yanks and enemy pulls to gain the upper hand on your enemies. When I mentioned that the combat had depth, it's regarding the moveset for each Spider-Man. The moves that Peter and Miles can do are the same to some degree, but a lot of things only one of them can do and the other cannot. These come in the form of abilities that are tied to Miles' bioelectricity powers or Peter's symbiote abilities. When you finally obtain these abilities, you can figure out what works best with each enemy and when to use them. But that's only the beginning, because once you get a handle on your favorite combos to perform, you can chain together those moves and add an ability on top of that. So if you're Peter and perform a combo that's 4 to 5 button combinations, you can add a symbiote ability to end it off or use that in addition to more combos. And we haven't even talked about the gadgets yet. Unlike the last game, there isn't a slew of gadgets to choose from, but this time around there's a handful that each serve a specific purpose. They're upgradable, with you needing tokens to unlock bonuses to make them more powerful and more efficient. If there's one you should upgrade as soon as you get it, it's the concussion burst. Trust me, it'll help you later on. But how do the gadgets relate to the combat? Like I just mentioned, you can chain combos together to perform devastating moves on both normal enemies and bosses. Once you have enough gadgets, you can throw in multiple gadget attacks as well, extending the combo even further. So let me give you an example. You're playing as Peter and perform 4 basic attacks. You then can use a symbiote ability followed up by a gadget attack, all which will hit the enemy. Depending on the gadget you use, you'll be able to juggle the enemy mid-air, adding more opportunities for combos. The juggling not only applies to small enemies but the main bosses too. Many times I was fighting a boss and I would start a combo, then use a gadget, only for them to be thrust into the air where I could keep going with that combo. Once you figured out what gadget and ability works best against each enemy, defeating everyone and everything became a breeze. If you play this game, be sure to play on at least amazing difficulty. My playthrough was on spectacular, and even then I didn't start dying until over halfway through the main story. The normal fights can be tricky at times, but once you unlock enough abilities and gadgets, you'll be able to handle any amount of enemies. It's worth noting that the boss fights towards the latter half of the game are somewhat challenging on spectacular. It took me a handful of times to understand their patterns and see where their openings were so I could execute the long combos. When juggling the bosses, the long combos do work, but the bosses have some sort of revenge value in place, so they don't stay up in the air forever. Even if you parry an attack and launch them mid-air, you can only perform so many attacks before they retreat somewhere else or attack right through your own combo. I'm glad this was implemented to prevent us from getting each boss in mid-air and performing an insane number of combos until the fight was over. A good way to prevent cheesing any of these sections. When you break it down, this mechanic is simple, but once you start fighting enemies that have complex mix-ups of these flashes, things can get tricky. In many of the earlier fights, you will have the enemy perform just one type of attack that's easy to read and anticipate. But in later encounters, the mix-ups can get a bit confusing until you memorize each pattern. Depending on the fight, a boss can use normal combos followed by any combination of red, yellow, or blue attacks, and it's up to you to react fast enough to each one. The parry window is small and spectacular, so you really have to pay attention or you can die pretty fast. If I had to guess, the parry window is larger on the easier difficulties, making the combat easier overall. If the parry bothers you too much, you could always go into the accessibility options and decrease it from there. Personally, I have too much pride and can never go that route, at least for a Spider-Man game. To make matters worse, when dodging these attacks, there may be swarms of smaller enemies all around you as well. Each combat scenario makes it vital that you pay attention to all enemies on the screen, no matter their position. Even if an enemy is across the area and you're fighting 4 enemies at once, you could still get hit with an attack by the enemy in the far distance if you're not paying attention. Once you get the hang of the fighting, each moment will have you locked in, like you're the one fighting the enemy. New to this game was the addition of health gauges for the boss fights. I won't show the bosses, but the gauges aren't distracting and fit well within the HUD. They're placed right in the middle of the screen too, making it easier for you to glance up and see how much life the boss has left. To separate the phases, there's circles in the top left corner underneath each bar, letting you know how many phases you have to go until the fight's over or until you move on to the next phase. This will help you when getting deep into the fight and forgetting which part you're actually on. Regarding the actual boss fights themselves, I'd say they're better than the last games and are a lot more difficult. Because this game makes you earn a full bar of focus to heal instead of a partial bar, you can't keep constantly healing whenever you want, forcing you to chain together hits on the boss to fill up the meter. Having to fill up the meter makes it imperative that you learn the boss's patterns so you can dodge or parry attacks and heal yourself. In the last game, this wasn't the case, as hitting the enemy just once would give you some meters so you could heal and prevent getting knocked out. In terms of scale, these fights are bigger than before, but it's not consistent. Once you play through the game, you may agree. It depends on the fight in regards to the sheer epicness, but all of them are great. I can't sit here and point to one fight and say, yeah, that wasn't really good. They're all memorable for different reasons. Regarding the side content, yeah, a lot of the extra stuff to do is similar to the last game, but for some reason, they didn't feel as annoying this time around. They still consist of side missions, collectibles, and challenges, but this time they're character specific. If you didn't like them in the last 2 games, then you're not going to like them much in the sequel either. They're not as tedious as before and don't take as long to complete, so if you don't want to fly through the story, you're going to want to play these. The side missions are solid as they provide insight on other characters and offer some substance that wasn't present before. Even if you're not a fan of the side content, if you want to use all the suits, you're going to have to complete most of them because just finishing the story isn't enough. You'll earn a lot of suits by completing the game, but there's more that can't be unlocked because you complete optional activities. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that this game wouldn't be possible without the power of the PS5. There's many sections where levels are loading instantaneously and there is so much on the screen at once, there's no way a last-gen system would be able to handle it. The load times are pretty much non-existent, helping to maintain the flow when things have been ramped all the way up. If you play the game on performance mode, you may notice that the character models look a little rough around the edges at certain times, especially during the early sections of the game. It's like their faces look like clay, losing that touch of realism that they have most of the time. It's not as apparent later on, but at first, it can be a bit jarring because it's so noticeable. I didn't put it in fidelity at all, so maybe this issue isn't present when the mode is turned on, but even in performance, the game still looked great. While running at 60 FPS, I didn't notice any drops or graphical bugs, but I've heard that many people have experienced plenty of bugs during their playthroughs, so that's unfortunate. The only crash I had was one early in the game during a cutscene, but other than that, I didn't have any issues with crashes or glitches. However, if you're scared your game is going to crash, then be sure to make a manual save after each mission so you don't lose progress. When going through the city, the density is one thing that I noticed immediately. The city streets are filled with people and cars, all moving in different directions at the same time. This made the city feel more alive than it ever has, making those moments where you have to go to street level more intense and action-packed. The buildings have always looked good, but now they've been touched up so they really stand out when swinging in between them. Windows, doors, and rooftops all look like they've been enhanced, keeping them separate from the actual wall and helping them not to blend in so much. The weather in the game changes and it has a day and night cycle, making the city pop even more. I don't think I've played a game that has done an open world nighttime setting as well as this. Everything that I just mentioned about the buildings and streets is apparent at night, but when it's dark, all the lights across the city are bright and add even more realism to the game. Everything regarding the city helps add to the atmosphere and makes you feel like you really are in New York City as Spider-Man. In the end, Spider-Man 2 is the greatest Spider-Man game we have ever received to this point. There are countless of other Spider-Man games that all released, each with certain things that make them unique from the other. But as a complete package, this game is everything you could want in a superhero game. It's up to the person, but if you were to say that Spider-Man 2 is the best superhero game of all time, that wouldn't be a bad take. Even though there's some minor issues, when I think about what I wanted to see versus what we got and what's actually wrong with the game, they align more with nitpicks instead of actual criticisms. While making this review, I found myself trying to find things wrong with the game, and I just couldn't. If you're a Spider-Man fan, then you absolutely need to buy this game. The amount of surprises along with the replayability makes this game an instant classic. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 9.5.